Have you ever felt exhausted by endless self-help advice telling you to wake up at 5 a.m., stay positive all the time, hustle harder, and somehow become the perfect version of yourself? What if the problem isn't you, but the self-help industry itself? In This Is Not a Self-Help Book by Mark Mehigan, you'll discover a brutally honest and surprisingly refreshing perspective on life, addiction, failure, mental health, and the pressure to constantly improve yourself. This audiobook summary is not about fake motivation or unrealistic success formulas. It's about learning how to accept your imperfections, break destructive habits, and finally stop pretending everything is okay. If you ever felt lost, overwhelmed, stuck in toxic routines, or tired of motivational content that never truly changes your life, then this video is for you. Stay until the end, because the lessons in this book might completely change the way you think about happiness, success, and what it actually means to live a meaningful life. In the introduction of This Is Not a Self-Help Book, Mark Mehigan immediately breaks the traditional rules of the self-help world. Instead of promising that you'll become rich, successful, perfectly disciplined, or endlessly happy after reading this book, he does something unexpected. He admits that life is messy, confusing, and sometimes painfully difficult. That honesty becomes the foundation of the entire book. Mark explains how modern self-help culture often makes people feel worse instead of better. Everywhere we look, someone is telling us to wake up earlier, work harder, meditate more, quit bad habits instantly, build a business, become emotionally perfect, and somehow transform into a better version of ourselves overnight. But for many people, this constant pressure creates guilt and exhaustion rather than growth. Imagine a person who already feels overwhelmed by work, family pressure, financial stress, or mental health struggles. Instead of feeling supported, they open social media and see influencers saying things like, "If you're not succeeding, you're just not trying hard enough." Over time, that message can make someone feel broken, lazy, or like they are failing at life. Mark challenges this mindset by showing that real growth doesn't start with pretending to be perfect. It starts with honesty. He shares parts of his own life with humor and vulnerability, showing that he himself didn't have everything figured out. This makes the book feel less like a lecture from a guru and more like a conversation with someone who understands how difficult life can actually be. One powerful idea introduced here is that many people are addicted not only to bad habits, but also to the fantasy of becoming a completely different person. People often think, once I lose weight, earn more money, fix my anxiety, or become more productive, then I'll finally be happy. But Mark argues that this mindset keeps happiness permanently in the future. For example, imagine someone who spends years chasing promotions at work, believing that success will finally bring peace, only to discover that every achievement creates a new pressure, a new fear, and a new target to chase. The problem wasn't a lack of success. It was a belief that self-worth depended entirely on achievement. The introduction also encourages viewers to question the advice they consume every day. Are you improving yourself because you genuinely want a healthier and more meaningful life, or because you secretly feel like you are not good enough as you are? That reflective question sits at the heart of this chapter. Mark doesn't tell people to stop growing or learning. Instead, he warns against turning self-improvement into self-hatred. There is a major difference between wanting to grow and constantly feeling ashamed of who you currently are. Think about how many people create impossible routines for themselves after watching motivational videos online. They plan to wake up at 4 a.m., read 2 books a week, exercise daily, avoid all distractions, and work nonstop. For a few days they feel inspired, but when reality becomes difficult, they fail to maintain the routine and begin criticizing themselves harshly. The cycle repeats again and again. Mark suggests that sustainable growth comes from self-awareness, patience, and honesty, not from unrealistic expectations. One of the most relatable parts of this introduction is a reminder that everybody struggles, even the people who appear confident and successful. Social media often hides pain behind carefully edited photos and motivational quotes, making ordinary people feel isolated in their struggles. But behind closed doors, many people are dealing with anxiety, insecurity, loneliness, addiction, or confusion about their future. This chapter reminds the audience that struggling does not make you weak, it makes you human. Instead of constantly asking, "How can I become perfect?" Mark encourages readers to ask better questions. What kind of life actually makes me feel fulfilled? Am I chasing goals that truly matter to me? Am I improving because I love myself or because I hate myself? These questions force people to slow down and examine the direction of their lives instead of blindly following trends. The most valuable lesson from this introduction is that real change begins when people stop pretending. The book invites readers to remove the mask they wear for society and become honest about their fears, habits, insecurities, and desires. That honesty can feel uncomfortable at first, but it also creates freedom. If someone admits they are exhausted, lonely, addicted, or unhappy, they can finally begin addressing the real problem instead of hiding it behind fake positivity. Viewers can apply this lesson in their own lives immediately by spending a few minutes every day reflecting honestly on their emotions instead of distracting themselves constantly with entertainment, social media, or work. Even simple habits like journaling, having honest conversations with trusted people, or questioning unrealistic expectations can slowly create healthier self-awareness. Main points. The book rejects fake positivity and unrealistic self-help promises. Constant pressure to become perfect often creates anxiety and self-hatred. Real growth begins with honesty, not pretending everything is okay. Self-improvement should come from self-respect, not self-loathing. Social media often hides the struggles that everyone secretly faces. Happiness cannot always be delayed until some future achievement. Sustainable change comes through patience, awareness, and realistic expectations. Actionable lessons. Ask yourself whether your goals truly matter to you or are simply influenced by social pressure. Stop comparing your behind-the-scenes life to other people's highlight reels online. Replace impossible routines with small habits you can realistically maintain. Spend time reflecting honestly on your emotions instead of constantly escaping from them. Practice self-improvement from a place of compassion rather than constant criticism. Start accepting that being imperfect does not mean you are failing at life. Reflective questions. Are you trying to improve your life? Or are you trying to escape who you are? What expectations are making you feel constantly exhausted or not enough? How much of your stress comes from comparing yourself to others? What would change if you stopped chasing perfection and focus on honesty instead? In the chapter Mark Mehigan's Chaotic 20s, Mark Mehigan paints a brutally honest picture of what it feels like to drift through early adulthood without direction, stability, or a clear sense of identity. Instead of presenting his 20s as an exciting journey filled with constant success and self-discovery, he describes them as confusing, reckless, emotionally unstable, and at times deeply destructive. This honesty makes the chapter incredibly relatable because many people secretly experience the same chaos but feel ashamed to admit it. Society often romanticizes your 20s as the best years of your life, but Mark exposes a hidden reality that for many people, these years are filled with uncertainty, poor decisions, financial stress, unhealthy coping mechanisms, broken relationships, and the exhausting pressure to figure life out before everyone else seems to do it first. One of the most powerful ideas in this chapter is how easy it is to lose yourself while trying to fit into the expectations of other people. Mark describes how he spent years chasing temporary distractions instead of confronting deeper emotional issues. Nights out, drinking, impulsive decisions, and avoiding responsibility became ways to escape uncomfortable feelings. At first, these behaviors felt exciting and freeing, but over time they slowly turned into patterns that left him feeling emptier than before. Many viewers may recognize this cycle in their own lives. Imagine someone who spends every weekend partying because they fear being alone with their thoughts. Or someone who constantly switches jobs, relationships, or hobbies because they hope the next thing will finally make them feel complete. On the outside, their life may look fun and spontaneous, but internally they feel anxious, lost, and emotionally disconnected. Mark's story reveals how people often use chaos as a distraction from deeper pain they don't yet know how to face. The chapter also explores the pressure young adults feel when comparing themselves to others. During your 20s, it can seem like everyone around you is moving ahead while you remain stuck. One friend gets married, another buys a house, someone else builds a successful career, and suddenly you begin measuring your worth against timelines created by society. Mark explains how dangerous this comparison can become because it creates panic and insecurity. Instead of making thoughtful decisions, people start rushing into careers, relationships, or lifestyles simply because they are afraid of falling behind. Imagine a person accepting a job they hate because it looks impressive to others, or staying in a toxic relationship because they fear being too old to start over. These choices often create long-term unhappiness because they are driven by fear rather than genuine fulfillment. Another important lesson in this chapter is how unresolved emotional pain quietly shapes behavior. Mark reflects on how many of his destructive habits were not random at all. They were connected to insecurity, loneliness, low self-worth, and avoidance. This is something many people fail to recognize in their own lives. Sometimes people blame themselves for lacking discipline without understanding the emotional reasons behind their actions. For example, a person may constantly procrastinate, not because they are lazy, but because they are terrified of failure. Someone may overwork themselves every day, not because they love productivity, but because slowing down would force them to confront uncomfortable emotions. Mark encourages readers to stop judging themselves so harshly and instead ask deeper questions about why they behave the way they do. What makes this chapter especially engaging is that Mark balances heavy topics with humor and self-awareness. He doesn't portray himself as a victim or try to make himself look wise after the fact. Instead, he openly admits how irrational and messy many of his choices were. This honesty creates trust with the audience because it feels real. Many self-help stories only show the polished after version of someone's life, but Mark focuses on confusion before the transformation. That is why this chapter resonates so strongly. It reminds people that being lost does not mean your life is ruined. Sometimes chaos becomes a thing that forces you to eventually become more self-aware. The chapter also challenges the idea that adulthood arrives suddenly with confidence and certainty. Many people believe there's a magical point where everyone finally becomes emotionally mature and completely sure about their future. But Mark shows that most adults are simply learning as they go, making mistakes, adapting, and trying to survive pressures nobody fully prepared them for. This realization can actually feel freeing. You do not need to have every answer at 25 or 30. Life is not a race where everyone follows the same timeline successfully. Viewers can apply the lessons from this chapter by becoming more honest about the habits and distractions they use to avoid difficult emotions. Instead of constantly escaping discomfort through entertainment, social media, unhealthy relationships, or addictive behaviors, they can begin examining what they are truly running from. Even small changes, like spending quiet time reflecting on personal goals, reducing harmful habits gradually, or seeking support from trusted people, can create meaningful long-term growth. The chapter reminds us that chaos itself is not the enemy, refusing to learn from it is. Main points. Your 20s are often far more confusing and chaotic than society admits. Many people use distractions and destructive habits to escape emotional pain. Constant comparison with others creates unnecessary pressure and insecurity. Fear of falling behind causes people to make decisions that don't truly fulfill them. Many unhealthy behaviors are connected to deeper emotional struggles. Being lost in life does not mean you are failing. It means you are human. Real growth begins when you stop avoiding your emotions and start understanding them. Actionable lessons. Pay attention to the habits you use to escape stress or emotional discomfort. Stop comparing your life timeline to other people's achievements. Ask yourself whether your current goals genuinely matter to you or are based on external pressure. Spend time alone reflecting instead of constantly distracting yourself. Accept that confusion and uncertainty are a normal part of adulthood. Focus on gradual improvement instead of trying to completely transform overnight. Reflective questions. What distractions do you use to avoid difficult emotions? Are you making life choices based on your values or based on fear of falling behind? What habits in your life might actually be symptoms of deeper emotional struggles if nobody else was judging your progress? What kind of life would you truly want? Are you chasing happiness, or are you simply trying to escape discomfort? In the chapter Alcohol, Addiction and Escapism, Mark Mehigan dives into one of the darkest and most emotionally raw parts of his life, revealing how addiction rarely begins with dramatic collapse. Instead, it often starts quietly, disguised as harmless fun, stress relief, or a way to temporarily silence uncomfortable emotions. Mark explains how alcohol slowly became more than just a social activity for him. It transformed into an escape route, a way to avoid anxiety, insecurity, loneliness, self-doubt, and the pressure of dealing with reality. What makes this chapter so powerful is that it forces readers to confront a difficult truth. Addiction is not always about the substance itself. Sometimes it is about the emotional pain people are desperately trying not to feel. At first, alcohol gave Mark confidence, excitement, and temporary relief. It made awkward situations easier, quieted racing thoughts, and created moments where problems felt distant. But over time, the line between having fun and emotional dependence became blurred. This is something many people experience without realizing it. Imagine a person who starts drinking every Friday night just to relax after work. Then eventually, they begin needing alcohol after stressful days, during emotional arguments, or whenever life feels overwhelming. Slowly, the habit stops being about enjoyment and starts becoming emotional survival. Mark highlights how dangerous this transition can be because it happens gradually. Most people do not wake up one day deciding to destroy their lives. Instead, destructive habits quietly become routines while people convince themselves they are still in control. The chapter also expands the idea of addiction beyond alcohol itself. Mark suggests that escapism exists in many forms. Some people escape through drinking, others through endless scrolling on social media, gaming for entire nights, binge eating, gambling, toxic relationships, overworking, or constantly distracting themselves with noise and entertainment. The common pattern is emotional avoidance. Instead of facing pain directly, people search anything that numbs it temporarily. This part of the book feels especially relevant in modern life because distractions are available everywhere. Imagine someone who feels deeply unhappy but spends every free moment consuming content online because silence forces them to confront emotions they are trying to avoid. Or someone who constantly stays busy because slowing down would force them to admit they feel empty inside. Mark's honesty reveals how easily people can become trapped in cycles of avoidance without understanding the deeper emotional reasons behind their behavior. One of the most heartbreaking ideas in this chapter is how addiction slowly disconnects people from themselves and others. At first, the escape feels comforting, but eventually it creates isolation. Relationships weaken, self-respect declines, responsibilities become harder to manage, and the person begins living in a constant cycle of guilt and temporary relief. Mark explains that addiction often creates two versions of a person, the public version pretending everything is fine, and the private version struggling internally. Many viewers may relate to this hidden battle. Someone may appear funny, social, and confident around friends while secretly feeling exhausted, anxious, or emotionally broken when alone. This dual life becomes emotionally draining because maintaining the illusion requires constant energy. The chapter also challenges the stereotype that addiction only affects people who are completely fallen apart. Mark makes it clear that many functioning people secretly struggle with unhealthy dependencies while continuing to work jobs, maintain friendships, and appear normal from the outside. This is important because it removes the false belief that someone must hit absolute rock bottom before recognizing a problem. Sometimes the warning signs are smaller and quieter, constantly needing distractions to feel okay, being unable to sit alone with your thoughts, depending on substances or habits to manage emotions, or feeling emotionally empty without constant stimulation. What makes this section deeply meaningful is that Mark does not simply condemn addiction with moral judgment. Instead, he approaches it with honesty and compassion. He understands that people escape because something inside them hurts. This perspective encourages viewers to replace shame with self-awareness. Instead of asking, "What's wrong with me?" people can begin asking, "What pain am I trying to avoid?" That shift changes everything. For example, someone who constantly drinks after stressful workdays may realize the real issue is burnout and emotional exhaustion, not just alcohol itself. Someone addicted to validation online may realize they are desperately seeking self-worth they never developed internally. Viewers can apply the lesson from this chapter by becoming more conscious of the habits they use to numb discomfort. The goal is not perfection overnight, but awareness. Small steps matter. Spending a few minutes alone without distractions, journaling honestly about emotional triggers, limiting unhealthy coping habits gradually, or having vulnerable conversations with trusted people can slowly break cycles of avoidance. Mark's story reminds readers that healing begins when people stop running from themselves. Escapism may provide temporary relief, but long-term peace only comes from facing reality honestly, even when it feels uncomfortable. Main points. Addiction often begins as a way to escape emotional pain, stress, or insecurity. Alcohol and other distractions can slowly become emotional crutches. Escapism exists in many forms beyond substances, including social media, overworking, gaming, and toxic habits. Addiction usually develops gradually, making it difficult to recognize early. Many people secretly struggle while appearing fine on the outside. Emotional avoidance creates long-term isolation and disconnection from oneself. Healing starts with understanding the pain beneath the behavior instead of only judging the habit itself. Actionable lessons. Identify the habits you rely on whenever you feel stressed, lonely, anxious, or overwhelmed. Practice sitting with discomfort for short periods instead of instantly distracting yourself. Start journaling emotional triggers and patterns honestly. Replace self-judgment with curiosity and self-awareness. Reach out to trusted people instead of isolating yourself emotionally. Focus on gradual improvement rather than expecting instant transformation. Reflective questions. What do you turn to when you want to escape uncomfortable emotions? Are your habits helping you heal, or simply helping you avoid reality temporarily? What emotions are hardest for you to sit with alone? Do you truly feel connected to yourself, or are you constantly distracting yourself from deeper thoughts? What would change in your life if you stopped escaping and started confronting the root causes of your pain? In the chapter Living Behind a Fake Successful Image, Mark Mehigan explores the exhausting pressure pretending everything is fine while internally falling apart. He explains how modern society rewards appearances so heavily that many people become experts at looking successful without actually feeling fulfilled, emotionally stable, or genuinely happy. This chapter exposes one of the most dangerous traps of modern life, building an identity around how things appear instead of how they truly are. Mark reflects on periods of his life where he carefully maintained an image that suggested confidence, control, and success, even while privately struggling with anxiety, unhealthy habits, emotional emptiness, and self-doubt. The more he tried to protect this image, the more disconnected he became from his authentic self. One of the most relatable ideas in this chapter is how easy it is to confuse performance with reality. Many people spend enormous energy managing how others perceive them. Social media has intensified this behavior because it allows people to selectively display the most polished parts of their lives while hiding the painful ones. Imagine someone posting photos of expensive vacations, luxury purchases, gym progress, and smiling moments with friends while secretly battling loneliness, debt, burnout, or depression. To outsiders, their life looks perfect, but privately, they feel trapped by the pressure to keep performing happiness even when they are emotionally exhausted. Mark argues that this fake image becomes emotionally dangerous because people eventually feel unable to admit the truth, even to themselves. The chapter also examines how society often ties self-worth to external achievements. Many people are taught from a young age that success means having the right career, enough money, an attractive lifestyle, social status, or constant productivity. As a result, people begin chasing symbols of success instead of asking whether those things genuinely make them feel fulfilled. Imagine a person working 70-hour weeks in a high-paying job they secretly hate because society tells them success should look impressive. They buy expensive things, receive praise from others, and appear accomplished, but every morning they wake up feeling emotionally numb. Over time, they become terrified of slowing down because their entire identity depends on maintaining the image they built. Mark reveals how many people become prisoners of the lives they created to impress others. One of the most powerful moments in this chapter is the realization that fake success often creates isolation. When people are constantly pretending to be okay, they lose the ability to form honest connections. Vulnerability becomes dangerous because it threatens the image they work so hard to protect. This creates a lonely cycle where people crave understanding and emotional connection, while simultaneously hiding the very struggles that would allow genuine connection to happen. Think about someone who constantly jokes, acts confident, and gives advice to everyone around them, yet never admits when they themselves are struggling. Friends may admire them, but nobody truly knows them. Eventually, the person starts feeling invisible behind the character they created. Mark also discusses the emotional exhaustion that comes from constantly comparing yourself to others. In a world filled with carefully edited success stories, people begin feeling like they are permanently behind. Someone buys a house, someone launches a business, someone gets married, someone becomes famous online, and suddenly ordinary life starts feeling like failure. This pressure causes many people to fake confidence because they fear judgment. Instead of admitting confusion or uncertainty, they pretend to have everything under control. But internally, the anxiety grows stronger because the gap between appearance and reality keeps expanding. What makes this chapter especially impactful is that Mark does not claim authenticity is easy. Being honest about your struggles can feel uncomfortable because society often rewards performance more than vulnerability. However, he argues that living truthfully is ultimately far less painful than constantly maintaining a false identity. Real peace comes when people stop building their lives around external validation and start focusing on internal fulfillment. For example, Someone may realize they do not actually enjoy chasing status or material success, but instead value creativity, meaningful relationships, health, or emotional stability. Admitting this truth may require changing their lifestyle, disappointing others, or letting go of certain expectations, but it also creates freedom. This chapter offers practical lessons viewers can apply immediately. One important step is becoming aware of where you are performing instead of living honestly. Ask yourself whether certain behaviors are driven by genuine desire or by fear judgment. Another helpful practice is creating spaces where honesty is possible, whether through journaling, therapy, close friendships, or simply admitting when you are struggling instead of automatically saying, "I'm fine." Mark's message is not that ambition or success are bad. The problem begins when people sacrifice their mental health, identity, and authenticity just to maintain appearances. The deeper lesson here is that no amount of external success can fully compensate for internal emptiness. A carefully crafted image may impress people temporarily, but it cannot replace self-respect, emotional peace, or genuine human connection. The chapter reminds readers that the strongest people are not those who appear perfect all the time, but those who are honest enough to admit when life is difficult. Main points. Many people create fake successful images to hide internal struggles. Social media encourages performance instead of authenticity. External achievements do not automatically create happiness or fulfillment. Constantly maintaining a fake image leads to emotional exhaustion and isolation. Society often pressures people to define success through status and appearances. Real connection becomes impossible when people hide their true selves. Authenticity may feel uncomfortable, but it creates long-term peace and freedom. Actionable lessons. Notice where you are performing for approval instead of acting authentically. Stop comparing your real life to other people's curated online lives. Define success based on your personal values instead of social expectations. Practice admitting when you are struggling instead of pretending everything is fine. Spend time identifying what genuinely fulfills you emotionally. Build relationships where honesty and vulnerability are possible. Reflective questions. How much of your life is influenced by the desire to appear successful? Are you chasing goals that truly matter to you, or goals that impress others? What parts of yourself are you hiding from people around you? Do you feel emotionally fulfilled, or only externally validated? What would change if you stopped performing and started living more honestly? In the chapter Mental Health Struggles, Mark Mehigan opens up about the exhausting internal battles that many people experience silently every day. Instead of presenting mental health struggles as dramatic moments that are always visible from the outside, he explains how they often appear quietly in everyday life, through constant overthinking, emotional numbness, anxiety, self-doubt, loneliness, burnout, and the feeling that something is wrong even when life appears normal on the surface. One of the most powerful aspects of this chapter is its honesty. Mark does not try to sound inspirational or pretend that mental health recovery is simple. Instead, he shows how confusing and isolating these struggles can feel, especially when you do not fully understand what is happening inside your own mind. He describes how mental health problems can slowly distort the way a person sees themselves and the world around them. A small failure begins to feel like proof that you are worthless. One awkward conversation can replay in your head for days. A bad week starts feeling like a ruined future. This is something many people secretly experience but rarely talk about openly. Imagine a person lying awake at night replaying every mistake they made during the day while everyone else around them seems relaxed and carefree. Or someone sitting in a room full of friends yet feeling emotionally disconnected and strangely alone. On the outside, they smile, joke, and continue functioning normally, but internally they feel exhausted from fighting battles nobody else can see. Mark's writing captures this hidden emotional fatigue in a way that feels painfully real. One major theme in this chapter is how people often become trapped trying to appear normal while struggling mentally. Society still pressures people to hide vulnerability because admitting emotional pain can feel embarrassing or weak. As a result, many people develop coping mechanisms that only make things worse. Some bury themselves in work to avoid thinking. Others use alcohol, endless entertainment, social media, or unhealthy relationships to temporarily escape their thoughts. Some simply isolate themselves completely. Mark explains that these distractions may provide short-term relief, but they do not solve the deeper emotional issues underneath. In fact, avoidance often strengthens anxiety because the mind never gets a chance to properly process difficult emotions. The chapter also explores the dangerous habit of self-criticism. Many people speak to themselves in ways they would never speak to another human being. One mistake becomes, I'm useless. One rejection becomes, nobody cares about me. One difficult period becomes, my life is going nowhere. Mark highlights how destructive this inner dialogue can become over time because people start believing these thoughts are objective truths rather than temporary emotional reactions. Imagine a student failing one exam and immediately concluding they are a failure in life, or a person going through a breakup and convincing themselves they are unlovable. Mental health struggles often magnify pain and shrink perspective, making temporary problems feel permanent. Another important idea in this chapter is that healing rarely happens instantly. Modern culture loves dramatic transformation stories where someone changes their entire life overnight, but Mark presents recovery as slower, messier, and more realistic. Some days feel hopeful, while others feel heavy again for no obvious reason. Progress is not always visible immediately. This honesty matters because many people quit trying to improve their mental health when they do not see instant results. For example, someone may begin journaling, exercising, reducing unhealthy habits, or opening up emotionally, but after a few difficult days they assume nothing is working and give up completely. Mark reminds readers that healing is often built through small, consistent actions rather than one life-changing breakthrough moment. What makes this chapter especially engaging is that it removes the feeling of isolation many viewers carry silently. Mental health struggles often convince people that they are uniquely broken, but Mark repeatedly emphasizes how common these feelings actually are. Many people secretly feel overwhelmed, anxious, emotionally lost, or disconnected despite appearing successful on the outside. Understanding this can reduce shame and create compassion both for yourself and for others. The chapter encourages readers to stop treating emotional pain like a personal failure and start seeing it as part of being human. There are also deeply practical lessons viewers can apply in their own lives. One important step is learning to notice harmful thought patterns instead of automatically believing them. Just because your mind tells you something negative does not mean it is objectively true. Another helpful practice is reducing constant overstimulation and creating moments of quiet reflection. Many people never allow themselves to process emotions because they fill every empty moment with scrolling, entertainment, or distractions. Mark suggests that uncomfortable emotions often become less terrifying once people stop running from them constantly. He also encourages seeking support instead of suffering in silence. Talking honestly with trusted people, therapists, friends, or support groups can break the illusion that you must carry everything alone. The deeper message of this chapter is not that life suddenly becomes easy, but that people can learn healthier ways to respond to emotional pain. Mental health struggles do not define a person's worth, and experiencing anxiety, sadness, confusion, or emotional exhaustion does not mean someone is weak. Often, the strongest people are those quietly fighting battles nobody else can see while still trying to move forward each day. Main points. Mental health struggles are often invisible from the outside. Anxiety, overthinking, loneliness, and emotional exhaustion can quietly consume people. Many people hide their struggles because they fear judgment or appearing weak. Escaping emotions through distractions usually worsens problems long-term. Self-criticism and negative inner dialogue deeply affect mental well-being. Healing is gradual, inconsistent, and built through small steps over time. Emotional pain does not make someone broken. It makes them human. Actionable lessons. Pay attention to how you speak to yourself during difficult moments. Stop treating every negative thought as an objective truth. Reduce unhealthy distractions and create quiet time for reflection. Practice small healthy habits consistently instead of expecting instant transformation. Reach out for emotional support instead of isolating yourself completely. Be patient with your healing process instead of judging yourself harshly. Reflective questions. What thoughts do you repeatedly tell yourself during stressful moments? Are you coping with emotions in healthy ways or simply escaping them temporarily? How often do you allow yourself to be emotionally honest with others? What distractions are preventing you from confronting deeper feelings? If you treated yourself with the same compassion you give others, how would your life change? In the chapter Nearing Rock Bottom, Mark Mehigan describes a terrifying moment when years of emotional avoidance, destructive habits, addiction, and pretending everything is fine begin collapsing under their own weight. What makes this chapter so gripping is that rock bottom is not presented as one dramatic Hollywood-style disaster. Instead, Mark explains that for many people, it arrives slowly and quietly. It can feel like waking up one morning and realizing you no longer recognize yourself. The habits that once felt exciting now feel empty. The distractions no longer numb the pain. Relationships become strained, motivation disappears, and deep inside, there's an uncomfortable awareness that something in your life is fundamentally wrong. This chapter captures the frightening moment when denial stops working. Mark reflects on how people often convince themselves they are still in control long after things have started falling apart. Someone may continue going to work, socializing, posting online, and functioning outwardly while internally they feel emotionally exhausted and completely disconnected from themselves. This is what makes nearing rock bottom so dangerous. Many people do not recognize how bad things have become because they are comparing themselves only to worse scenarios. They think, at least I'm not completely ruining my life, while ignoring the growing emotional damage happening quietly every day. Imagine a person drinking heavily every night but still paying bills and maintaining a job, so they convince themselves there is no real problem. Or someone constantly overwhelmed with anxiety and burnout who keeps saying, I just need to push harder, while their mental health slowly deteriorates. Mark reveals how human beings are incredibly skilled at rationalizing unhealthy behavior when facing the truth feels too painful. One of the most powerful ideas in this chapter is how emotional numbness becomes a warning sign. At first, people chase distractions because they want to feel better. But eventually, many stop feeling much at all. Joy fades. Excitement disappears. Even achievements feel empty. Life becomes a cycle of surviving instead of living. Mark explains how frightening it is to realize you are existing on autopilot, repeating the same destructive patterns while watching your emotional energy slowly disappear. Many viewers may recognize this feeling in modern life. Someone wakes up tired, scrolls endlessly on their phone, works a job they hate, escapes through unhealthy habits at night, and repeats the cycle daily without ever asking whether they are truly happy. Over time, this creates a quiet despair that is difficult to explain to others because nothing appears catastrophically wrong from the outside. The chapter also explores the loneliness that often comes before change. When people are nearing rock bottom, they often isolate themselves emotionally because shame becomes overwhelming. They may avoid honest conversations, distance themselves from supportive people, or hide behind humor and fake confidence. Imagine someone surrounded by friends who secretly feels completely alone because they believe nobody would understand what they are really going through. Or a person who constantly says, I'm fine, because admitting the truth feels too frightening. Mark's honesty here is deeply relatable because many people spend years silently suffering while pretending to function normally. Another important lesson in this chapter is that rock bottom often forces clarity. When distractions stop working and denial becomes impossible, people are finally confronted with a reality they have been avoiding. As painful as this moment is, Mark suggests it can also become the beginning of transformation. Sometimes people only start changing when continuing the same lifestyle becomes more painful than facing the fear of change itself. Think about someone who ignores burnout until their body physically forces them to slow down, or a person trapped in addiction who only seeks help after realizing they are destroying relationships and losing themselves emotionally. These moments feel devastating, but they can also create honesty for the first time in years. What makes this chapter emotionally powerful is that Mark does not romanticize suffering. He does not claim people need to completely destroy their lives before changing. Instead, he warns readers to pay attention to smaller warning signs before reaching deeper levels of emotional collapse. Constant exhaustion, emotional numbness, dependence on unhealthy coping mechanisms, isolation, and loss of purpose are signals that should not be ignored. The chapter encourages viewers to stop waiting for a dramatic crisis before taking their emotional well-being seriously. There are practical lessons here that viewers can immediately apply in their own lives. One of the most important is learning to recognize patterns instead of focusing only on isolated incidents. Anyone can have a bad day, but repeated emotional exhaustion, unhealthy habits, and constant avoidance often point toward deeper problems. Another lesson is the importance of honesty. Mark emphasizes that people cannot change what they refuse to acknowledge. Even simple actions like admitting I'm not okay, reducing harmful routines gradually, reaching out to trusted people, or reflecting honestly about your current lifestyle can become the first steps toward recovery. The deeper message of this chapter is that rock bottom is not always a single catastrophic moment. Sometimes it is a quiet realization that the life you are living is slowly draining you emotionally. But within that realization is also opportunity. When people finally stop pretending and confront reality honestly, they create the possibility for genuine change. The chapter reminds readers that recognizing your pain is not weakness. Often, It is a beginning of reclaiming your life. Main points. Rock bottom often happens gradually rather than through one dramatic event. People frequently stay in denial while their emotional health deteriorates. Emotional numbness and exhaustion are major warning signs. Many individuals maintain a successful appearance while privately struggling deeply. Shame and isolation often increase when people are nearing emotional collapse. Painful moments can create clarity and force honest self-reflection. Real change begins when people stop denying their problems. Actionable lessons. Pay attention to repeated patterns of exhaustion, avoidance, or emotional numbness. Stop minimizing unhealthy behaviors simply because others seem worse. Practice honesty with yourself about how you are truly feeling. Reach out to supportive people before problems become overwhelming. Reflect on whether your current habits are helping you heal or slowly harming you. Make small changes early instead of waiting for a major crisis. Reflective questions. What warning signs in your life have you been ignoring? Are you truly happy or simply functioning on autopilot? What habits are you using to avoid difficult emotions? How often do you pretend everything is okay when it is not? What would happen if you became completely honest about your current emotional state? Are you waiting for a crisis before allowing yourself to change? In the chapter, The Danger of Destructive Habits, Mark Mehigan explains how the most dangerous habits in life are often the ones that feel normal at first. They rarely begin as obvious disasters. Instead, they start as small routines, comforting escapes, or harmless coping mechanisms that slowly grow powerful enough to shape a person's entire life. Mark shows how destructive habits are dangerous precisely because they develop gradually. People adapt to them little by little until unhealthy behavior becomes part of everyday existence. By the time the consequences become impossible to ignore, the habit is no longer just something you do occasionally. It has become part of your identity, emotional survival system, and daily routine. One of the strongest ideas in this chapter is that destructive habits are usually symptoms of deeper emotional struggles rather than random acts of laziness or weakness. People often judge themselves harshly for behaviors they do not fully understand. For example, someone may spend hours scrolling on social media every night and call themselves unproductive, but the real issue may be loneliness, anxiety, or fear of facing difficult thoughts in silence. Another person may constantly overeat, overwork, gamble, drink, or stay trapped in toxic relationships not because they consciously want to suffer, but because those behaviors temporarily numb emotional pain. Mark argues that many destructive habits begin as attempts to protect ourselves emotionally, but over time they quietly start damaging the very lives they were meant to help us survive. The chapter becomes especially relatable when Mark describes how easy it is to justify unhealthy routines. Human beings are experts at rationalization. Someone says, "I deserve this after a stressful day," or "I can stop whenever I want," or "everyone else does the same thing." These excuses create temporary comfort while allowing the behavior to continue growing stronger. Imagine a person who drinks heavily every weekend because it feels like the only way to relax. At first, it seems harmless and social. But eventually, weekends are not enough. Stressful weekdays begin triggering the same need for escape. Slowly, the person becomes emotionally dependent on the habit without fully realizing it. The frightening part is that most destructive habits do not announce themselves loudly at the beginning. They quietly integrate themselves into normal life. Mark also explores how destructive habits steal time and emotional energy in invisible ways. Many people think damage only happens during dramatic moments, but often the real danger is slower and quieter. A person may lose years trapped in routines that make them emotionally numb. Someone may stay in unhealthy environments, endlessly distract themselves, or sabotage their own potential simply because familiar pain feels safer than change. Think about someone who spends every evening escaping into endless entertainment because confronting their dissatisfaction with life feels overwhelming. Years pass, but nothing changes because a habit prevents self-reflection. Another person may repeatedly enter toxic relationships because chaos feels emotionally familiar, even though it keeps hurting them. Mark emphasizes that destructive habits are dangerous not only because of immediate consequences, but because they slowly disconnect people from the lives they actually want to live. One particularly powerful lesson in this chapter is how habits shape identity. Repeated behaviors influence the way people see themselves over time. Someone who constantly breaks promises to themselves may start believing they lack discipline or self-worth. Someone trapped in addiction may begin defining themselves entirely through shame. Mark explains that the psychological damage can become even more harmful than the habit itself because people stop believing change is possible. Imagine a person who has failed multiple times trying to improve their life. Eventually, they stop trying altogether because they convince themselves they are just that kind of person. This hopelessness becomes another prison created by the habit. What makes this chapter emotionally engaging is that Mark does not preach perfection or unrealistic transformation. He understands how comforting destructive habits can feel, especially during periods of stress, loneliness, or emotional pain. Instead of condemning people, he encourages awareness and honesty. The goal is not to become perfect overnight, but to begin recognizing the patterns that are quietly damaging your life. Many viewers may realize while listening that their biggest problem is not lack of intelligence or motivation, but unconscious routines repeated every day without reflection. The chapter also contains deeply practical lessons viewers can apply immediately. One important step is learning to identify emotional triggers behind behaviors. Instead of only focusing on stopping a habit, ask what emotional need the habit is trying to satisfy. Another helpful practice is replacing automatic behavior with conscious pauses. For example, before reaching for distraction, ask yourself, what am I actually feeling right now? Sometimes awareness alone weakens a cycle. Mark also emphasizes the importance of small, sustainable changes rather than extreme self-punishment. People often fail because they attempt dramatic overnight transformation instead of gradually building healthier patterns. The deeper message of this chapter is that habits quietly shape the direction of an entire life. Small, repeated actions become routines, routines become identity, and identity influences destiny. Destructive habits rarely destroy people instantly. Instead, they slowly pull them away from self-respect, emotional peace, meaningful relationships, and personal growth. But Mark also reminds readers that habits can be changed once people stop avoiding the truth. Awareness creates choice, and choice creates the possibility for a different future. Main points. Destructive habits usually begin as small coping mechanisms. Many unhealthy behaviors are rooted in emotional pain or avoidance. People often justify harmful habits to avoid confronting reality. Habits slowly shape identity and self-perception over time. Emotional numbness and repeated distractions can quietly waste years of life. Most destructive behaviors develop gradually rather than suddenly. Change begins with awareness and honesty about behavioral patterns. Actionable lessons. Identify the emotional triggers behind your unhealthy habits. Pay attention to the routines you repeat automatically every day. Replace self-hatred with curiosity and self-awareness. Practice pausing before reacting impulsively to stress or discomfort. Focus on small, consistent improvements instead of dramatic overnight change. Build healthier coping mechanisms such as reflection, exercise, honest conversations, or journaling. Reflective questions. What habits in your life are helping you escape rather than heal? What emotional needs are your destructive routines trying to satisfy? How much time and energy are your habits quietly taking from your future? Are your daily routines moving you closer to the person you want to become? What would happen if you stopped justifying behaviors that are harming you? Which small habit, if changed consistently, could improve your life the most? In the chapter Asking for Help, Mark Mehigan explores one of the hardest and most emotionally uncomfortable moments a person can face, admitting they cannot continue carrying everything alone. After spending years hiding pain behind distractions, humor, unhealthy habits, and a fake image of control, Mark reaches a point where pretending becomes more exhausting than telling the truth. What makes this chapter so powerful is that it reveals how many people secretly suffer not because help is unavailable, but because asking for it feels terrifying. Pride, shame, fear of judgment, and the belief that I should be able to handle this myself keep countless people trapped in silence for years. Mark explains that many people grow up associating independence with strength. They are taught to stay tough, avoid vulnerability, and solve problems privately. As a result, asking for help starts feeling like weakness instead of courage. Imagine someone struggling with anxiety every day but refusing to talk about it because they fear appearing dramatic or unstable. Or a person drowning in stress, addiction, depression, or emotional exhaustion who keeps smiling around others because they do not want to become a burden. From the outside, they may seem functional, but internally they are slowly collapsing under the pressure of carrying everything alone. Mark's honesty in this chapter makes it clear that silence often deepens suffering far more than vulnerability ever could. One of the most relatable ideas in this section is how people often wait until they are emotionally overwhelmed before finally reaching out. Instead of addressing problems early, they convince themselves they can push through a little longer. They normalize exhaustion, ignore warning signs, and continue functioning on autopilot until eventually their emotional energy runs out completely. Think about someone working non-stop while secretly struggling with burnout. Friends ask if they are okay, and they automatically reply, "I'm fine," even though they barely sleep, feel emotionally numb, and constantly battle stress internally. Over time, this emotional isolation creates a dangerous feeling that nobody understands what they are going through. But Mark explains that this loneliness is often self-created because people become so afraid of vulnerability that they never allow others to truly see them. The chapter also highlights the psychological relief that can come from finally being honest. Mark describes how exhausting it is to constantly maintain the illusion that everything is under control. The moment someone says, "I'm struggling," "I'm not okay," or "I need support," the emotional burden often begins to shift. This does not magically solve every problem, but it breaks the isolation that keeps pain growing in silence. Imagine a person carrying years of stress, addiction, anxiety, or sadness alone, convinced nobody would understand. Then one honest conversation reveals that other people have experienced similar struggles too. That realization can be life-changing because it destroys the illusion that suffering must always be faced in isolation. Another important lesson in this chapter is that help can take many forms. Some people need therapy or professional support. Others need honest conversations with trusted friends or family members. Some simply need permission to stop pretending they are okay all the time. Mark emphasizes that healing rarely happens entirely alone because human beings are emotionally wired for connection. Even small moments of vulnerability can create meaningful change. For example, someone admitting they are overwhelmed at work may finally receive support instead of silently burning out. A person opening up about emotional pain may discover they are far less alone than they believed. The chapter also challenges a misconception that asking for help means surrendering control. In reality, Mark argues that refusing help often allows destructive patterns to maintain control over your life. Real strength is not pretending to be invincible. Real strength is having the honesty and humility to recognize when something is no longer working. Many viewers may relate to the fear of vulnerability because modern culture constantly rewards confidence, independence, and appearing emotionally strong. Social media especially encourages people to showcase success rather than struggle. But this chapter reminds readers that emotional honesty is often the first real step toward healing. One particularly powerful idea is that many people delay asking for help because they believe their problems are not serious enough. They compare themselves to others and minimize their own pain. Someone thinks other people have it worse, so they continue suffering silently. But emotional pain does not need to become catastrophic before it deserves attention. Mark encourages readers to stop waiting for complete collapse before acknowledging their struggles. Early honesty can prevent deeper emotional damage later. There are deeply practical lessons viewers can apply from this chapter. One important step is learning to replace automatic emotional hiding with small moments of honesty. Instead of always saying, "I'm fine," practice expressing how you actually feel to trusted people. Another lesson is recognizing that vulnerability often strengthens relationships rather than weakening them. Genuine connection becomes possible only when people stop performing perfection constantly. Mark also encourages people to pay attention to the signs that they may need support. Chronic exhaustion, emotional numbness, constant stress, unhealthy coping habits, isolation, or feeling overwhelmed by daily life. The deeper message of this chapter is that asking for help is not proof that someone is broken. It is proof that they are human. Nobody is designed to carry emotional pain completely alone forever. Often, the moment people stop hiding and start speaking honestly is the moment real healing finally becomes possible. Main points. Many people avoid asking for help because of shame, pride, or fear judgment. Pretending everything is okay often increases emotional suffering. Emotional isolation can become more damaging than the original problem itself. Vulnerability creates opportunities for connection and healing. Asking for help is a sign of courage, not weakness. Support can come through therapy, friendships, honest conversations, or community. People should not wait for complete emotional collapse before seeking help. Actionable lessons. Practice being honest about your emotional state with trusted people. Stop minimizing your struggles simply because others may seem worse off. Notice signs of emotional burnout, numbness, or isolation early. Replace constant emotional masking with small moments of vulnerability. Seek support before problems become overwhelming. Understand that needing help is part of being human, not a personal failure. Reflective questions. What struggles are you currently hiding from others? Why does asking for help feel uncomfortable or frightening to you? Are you carrying emotional burdens alone that could be shared with someone you trust? How much energy do you spend pretending everything is fine? What would change if you allowed yourself to be more emotionally honest? Are you waiting for a crisis before giving yourself permission to seek support? In the chapter Recovery and Sobriety, Mark Mehigan reveals that recovery is far more complicated than simply quitting alcohol or abandoning destructive habits. Many people imagine sobriety as a clean, dramatic transformation where life instantly becomes peaceful and meaningful the moment someone stops drinking or escaping. But Mark honestly explains that recovery is not about magically becoming a new person overnight. In many ways, it is about learning how to live with yourself again after years of running away emotionally. That is what makes this chapter so emotionally powerful. It shows that sobriety is not only the removal of substances or harmful behaviors, it is a painful process of facing reality without the distractions that once numb pain. At first, Mark described recovery as deeply uncomfortable. For years, alcohol and escapism had acted like emotional armor, protecting him from anxiety, loneliness, insecurity, stress, and difficult memories. Once those distractions disappeared, all the emotions he had been avoiding suddenly became impossible to ignore. Imagine someone who spends years drinking every night to silence overthinking, only to discover that when the alcohol disappears, the thoughts remain. Or someone addicted to constant distractions who suddenly sits alone in silence for the first time in years and realizes how emotionally exhausted they truly are. This is one of the hardest parts of recovery that people rarely talk about. Removing the unhealthy habit does not automatically remove the emotional pain underneath it. One of the most relatable lessons in this chapter is that recovery often feels boring at first. Many destructive habits create intense stimulation, temporary excitement, or emotional escape. When those habits disappear, ordinary life can feel strangely empty. Mark explains how some people return to unhealthy behaviors not because they enjoy suffering, but because chaos has become emotionally familiar. A person who spent years escaping through alcohol, toxic relationships, gambling, or constant distraction may suddenly feel uncomfortable with calmness itself. Healthy routines can initially feel dull because the nervous system has become addicted to emotional extremes. This insight is incredibly important because many people assume recovery should always feel inspiring and motivating. In reality, it often requires learning how to tolerate ordinary life again without constantly searching for escape. The chapter also explores the emotional honesty required during sobriety. Mark explains that recovery forces people to confront the parts of themselves they spent years hiding. Regret, guilt, damaged relationships, lost time, and painful memories often resurface during the healing process. Imagine someone realizing how many important moments they missed because addiction or emotional avoidance controlled their life. Or a person recognizing that they hurt people they genuinely cared about while trapped in destructive cycles. These realizations can feel overwhelming, but Mark emphasizes that avoiding them only keeps people trapped in shame longer. True recovery begins when people stop denying reality and start taking responsibility without completely destroying themselves emotionally in the process. Another powerful idea in this chapter is that recovery is rarely linear. Some days feel hopeful, while others feel heavy and discouraging again. Progress happens slowly and inconsistently. This honesty makes the chapter feel authentic because many people quit trying to improve their lives after small setbacks. For example, someone trying to break an unhealthy habit may have a difficult day and immediately conclude they have failed completely. Mark challenges this all-or-nothing thinking by showing that healing is built through persistence, not perfection. Falling backward temporarily does not erase progress. What matters most is continuing to move forward instead of giving up entirely. The chapter also highlights how sobriety changes relationships and identity. When people stop participating in destructive behaviors, they often realize certain friendships or environments were built entirely around those habits. Someone who quits drinking may notice they no longer connect with people who only existed in their life for partying and escapism. This can feel lonely at first because recovery sometimes requires rebuilding your social world and rediscovering who you are without unhealthy coping mechanisms. Mark explains that this identity shift can be deeply uncomfortable but also freeing. Instead of constantly performing or escaping, people slowly begin reconnecting with their genuine personality, emotions, and values. One of the most hopeful lessons in this chapter is that recovery creates clarity. When people stop numbing themselves constantly, they begin noticing things they ignored for years, what truly matters to them, what environments drain them emotionally, what relationships feel genuine, and what kind of life they actually want to build. Imagine someone who spent years surviving emotionally finally beginning to enjoy simple moments again. Quiet mornings, meaningful conversations, hobbies, emotional stability, or feeling mentally present for the first time in years. These moments may seem small to outsiders, but for someone recovering from chaos and escapism, they feel life-changing. There are practical lessons viewers can apply from this chapter even if they are not dealing with addiction directly. Recovery is not only about substances, it is about breaking unhealthy cycles of emotional avoidance. Mark encourages people to become more aware of the behaviors they use to escape discomfort and to slowly replace them with healthier coping strategies. Small habits like exercise, journaling, honest conversations, therapy, reducing overstimulation, or simply learning to sit with difficult emotions can begin changing a person's relationship with themselves. The chapter reminds viewers that healing is not about becoming perfect. It is about becoming more present, more honest, and more connected to reality. The deeper message of this chapter is that sobriety and recovery are not punishments. They are opportunities to rebuild a life based on truth instead of escape. The process may feel uncomfortable, slow, and emotionally raw, but it also creates something many people spend years searching for: genuine peace. Main points. Recovery is about more than quitting harmful habits. It is about facing reality honestly. Sobriety often feels emotionally uncomfortable at first because distractions disappear. Many unhealthy behaviors are rooted in deep emotional pain. Recovery is gradual, inconsistent, and rarely perfect. Healing requires confronting guilt, regret, and painful truths honestly. Some relationships and environments become incompatible with recovery. Real peace comes from emotional presence rather than constant escape. Actionable lessons. Identify the behaviors you use to avoid uncomfortable emotions. Replace unhealthy coping habits with healthier routines gradually. Stop expecting instant transformation and focus on consistency instead. Learn to tolerate emotional discomfort without immediately escaping it. Build environments and relationships that support healthier choices. Practice self-awareness and patience during personal growth. Reflective questions. What distractions or habits are you using to avoid facing yourself honestly? How comfortable are you being alone with your thoughts without constant stimulation? Are your current routines helping you heal or keeping you emotionally stuck? What parts of your life would change if you stopped escaping discomfort? Are you expecting perfection from yourself instead of allowing gradual growth? What would genuine peace look like in your life beyond temporary relief? In the chapter Letting Go of Ego, Mark Mehigan explores how ego quietly controls much of human behavior without people even realizing it. He explains that ego is not just arrogance or narcissism in the obvious sense. Often, ego appears in much subtler ways: the constant need to appear successful, the fear of looking weak, the obsession with being right, the refusal to admit mistakes, or the desperate desire for approval and validation from others. Mark reveals that for years, his ego acted like a protective mask. It helped him hide insecurity, emotional pain, and self-doubt behind humor, confidence, distractions, and unhealthy behaviors. But over time, maintaining that image became emotionally exhausting because the more he tried protecting his ego, the further he drifted away from his authentic self. One of the most powerful ideas in this chapter is that ego often prevents people from healing. Many individuals remain trapped in destructive patterns not because they lack awareness, but because admitting the truth would damage the identity they have built around themselves. Imagine someone clearly struggling with addiction, burnout, or emotional pain, but refusing to ask for help because they want to appear strong. Or a person staying in a toxic relationship simply because ending it would feel like admitting failure. The ego constantly whispers dangerous ideas such as, "You can handle this alone," "You must never look weak," or "People must always admire you." Mark explains how these beliefs create emotional prisons where people spend more energy protecting appearances and actually improving their lives. The chapter also highlights how ego fuels comparison and insecurity. Modern life constantly encourages people to measure themselves against others. Careers, relationships, money, popularity, physical appearance, and social status all become competitions. Social media intensifies this because people are endlessly exposed to carefully edited versions of success. Someone sees another person buying a house, traveling the world, building a business, or gaining attention online, and suddenly their own life feels inadequate. Mark argues that ego thrives on comparison because it constantly needs proof of superiority or fearfully searches for signs of inferiority. Either way, peace becomes impossible because self-worth depends entirely on external validation. Imagine someone posting online not because they genuinely enjoy sharing moments, but because they desperately need likes, praise, or attention to feel valuable. Over time, their identity becomes dependent on how others react to them instead of how they genuinely feel inside. Another deeply relatable lesson in this chapter is how ego resists vulnerability. Many people avoid honest conversations because they fear embarrassment, rejection, or losing control of how others perceive them. Think about someone who never apologizes sincerely even when they know they are wrong because their pride cannot tolerate admitting fault. Or someone who constantly pretends to have life figured out while secretly struggling emotionally because they fear being judged. Mark explains that ego creates distance between people because genuine connection requires honesty, humility, and emotional openness. As long as someone is focused on protecting an image, they can never fully relax into authentic relationships. Mark also reflects on how letting go of ego can feel strangely terrifying at first. When people stop performing, comparing, or trying to prove themselves constantly, they often experience a deep sense of uncertainty. Without external validation, who are they really? This question forces people to confront uncomfortable truths about the identities they built around status, success, or approval. Imagine someone whose entire self-worth depends on being seen as productive, intelligent, attractive, or successful. If those external labels disappear, they suddenly feel lost because they never developed internal self-acceptance. Mark shows that many people spend years chasing achievements not because those things genuinely fulfill them, but because their ego believes external success will finally create inner peace. But the peace never lasts because ego always demands more. One of the most freeing ideas in this chapter is that humility creates emotional freedom. Letting go of ego does not mean becoming passive or lacking ambition. Instead, it means no longer basing your worth entirely on appearances, achievements, or other people's opinions. Mark explains that once people stop constantly trying to impress others, they gain the freedom to live more honestly. For example, someone may finally admit they are unhappy in a prestigious career and pursue work that feels more meaningful instead. Another person may stop pretending to be emotionally invincible and finally ask for support. These changes can feel uncomfortable because ego hates vulnerability, but they also create genuine peace. The chapter offers practical lessons viewers can apply immediately. One important step is learning to notice when pride is controlling decisions. Are you avoiding apologizing because you truly believe you are right, or because your ego fears looking weak? Are you chasing certain goals because they genuinely matter to you, or because they make you appear impressive? Another useful practice is becoming more comfortable with vulnerability. Honest conversations, admitting mistakes, asking questions, and accepting imperfections all weaken the ego's control gradually. Mark also encourages people to stop defining themselves entirely through achievements or external validation, because those things are unstable foundations for long-term self-worth. The deeper message of this chapter is that ego often promises protection while secretly creating suffering. It convinces people to build masks, compete endlessly, avoid vulnerability, and chase validation, yet none of those things create lasting fulfillment. Real peace begins when people stop trying so hard to protect an image and start becoming honest about who they truly are underneath it all. Main points. Ego is not only arrogance, it also appears as insecurity, pride, and the need for validation. Protecting appearances often prevents emotional healing and honest growth. Constant comparison destroys inner peace and self-worth. Ego resists vulnerability because it fears judgment and weakness. Many people base their identity entirely on external success and approval. Humility creates freedom by allowing people to live more authentically. Real confidence comes from self-acceptance rather than constant validation. Actionable lessons. Notice when pride or fear of judgment influences your decisions. Stop comparing your life constantly to other people's achievements. Practice admitting mistakes and apologizing honestly. Ask yourself whether your goals truly fulfill you or simply impress others. Become more comfortable with emotional honesty and vulnerability. Build self-worth through internal values instead of external validation. Reflective questions. How much of your identity depends on other people's opinions? What image are you constantly trying to protect? Are your goals driven by genuine passion or by the need for validation? What fears arise when you imagine being fully honest about your struggles? How often does pride prevent you from asking for help or admitting mistakes? What would your life look like if you no longer needed to impress anyone? In the chapter, The Power of Honesty, Mark Mehigan explains that true change in life rarely begins with motivation, confidence, or discipline. It begins with brutal honesty. Not the kind of honesty people show others on the surface, but the uncomfortable honesty people avoid having with themselves. Mark argues that many individuals stay trapped in unhealthy cycles for years because they keep lying to themselves about what is really happening in their lives. They say they are fine when they are emotionally exhausted. They call destructive habits stress relief. They pretend toxic relationships are normal. They convince themselves they are happy with lives that secretly drain them every day. This chapter becomes deeply powerful because it reveals how self-deception quietly steals years from people's lives while allowing problems to grow in silence. One of the most relatable ideas in this chapter is how exhausting dishonesty becomes over time. Mark explains that pretending requires constant emotional energy. Imagine someone who hates their job but spends years convincing themselves they are satisfied because the salary looks impressive. Every morning they wake up tired, anxious, and emotionally disconnected, yet they continue saying, "This is just how adulthood works." Or think about someone trapped in a relationship where they constantly feel ignored, unhappy, or emotionally unsafe, but they stay because admitting the truth would force painful change. The longer people avoid honesty, the heavier life begins to feel because deep inside they know something is wrong, even if they refuse to fully acknowledge it. The chapter also explores how dishonesty often begins as self-protection. People lie to themselves because the truth feels frightening. Admitting loneliness may force someone to confront how disconnected they feel from others. Admitting addiction may require changing painful habits. Admitting unhappiness may mean realizing they built their entire life around other people's expectations instead of their own values. Mark explains that people often avoid truth because they fear what will happen once they stop denying reality. But ironically, the avoidance itself usually causes more suffering than the truth ever would. Imagine a person who spends years distracting themselves with entertainment, alcohol, work, or social media because they are terrified of sitting alone with their thoughts. Their life may appear functional externally, but internally they feel increasingly lost because they never allow themselves to confront what they genuinely feel. One of the strongest moments in this chapter is the realization that honesty creates freedom. As long as people continue pretending, they remain emotionally trapped. But the moment someone honestly says, "I'm not okay, this lifestyle is hurting me," or "I'm deeply unhappy," change finally becomes possible. Mark emphasizes that honesty is painful initially because it destroys illusions people spent years building. However, it also removes the exhausting burden of performance. Imagine someone finally admitting they need help after years of silent suffering. That conversation may feel terrifying, but it also creates relief because they no longer have to carry the weight of pretending everything is under control. Mark also highlights how honesty strengthens relationships. Many people crave deep emotional connection, yet they constantly hide their real thoughts and feelings. As a result, relationships remain superficial because nobody truly knows each other. Think about a friendship where both people always joke around but never discuss what they are actually struggling with emotionally. Or a family where everyone pretends everything is normal while tension and pain remain unspoken underneath. Mark argues that vulnerability creates genuine connection because honesty allows people to feel seen instead of merely observed. Often, people discover they are far less alone than they imagine once they stop hiding behind carefully controlled versions of themselves. Another important lesson in this chapter is that honesty does not mean brutal self-hatred. Some people believe being honest with themselves means constantly criticizing every flaw and mistake. But Mark distinguishes honesty from self-destruction. True honesty means seeing reality clearly without exaggerating or denying it. For example, someone can honestly acknowledge they are struggling with unhealthy habits without convincing themselves they are worthless as a human being. A person can admit they made mistakes while still believing they deserve healing and growth. This balanced honesty is powerful because it creates accountability without crushing self-worth. The chapter becomes especially practical when Mark discusses how honesty can transform daily life. Many people live almost entirely on autopilot, repeating routines without ever questioning whether those routines align with the life they truly want. Honesty interrupts this automatic behavior. It forces questions such as, am I genuinely happy? Why do I keep repeating this habit? What emotions am I avoiding? Who am I trying to impress? These questions can feel uncomfortable, but they create awareness, and awareness creates a possibility for change. For example, someone may realize they are constantly overworking not because they love success, but because they fear feeling unimportant without achievement. Another person may recognize that their constant distractions are hiding unresolved emotional pain. There are practical lessons viewers can apply immediately from this chapter. One powerful step is developing the habit of regular self-reflection instead of constant distraction. Journaling honestly about emotions, behaviors, and fears can reveal patterns people usually avoid noticing. Another lesson is practicing small moments of truthfulness in conversations instead of automatically saying "I'm fine" when that is not true. Mark also encourages people to pay attention to where they feel emotionally drained because exhaustion often signals areas where they are living dishonestly or against their authentic values. The deeper message of this chapter is that honesty may feel uncomfortable in the short term, but dishonesty creates long-term suffering. People cannot change lives they refuse to see clearly. Real transformation begins when someone finally stops running, stops pretending, and faces reality with courage. The truth may not instantly solve every problem, but it removes the illusion that keeps people trapped. And sometimes, that single moment of honesty becomes the beginning of an entirely different life. Main points. Real change begins with honest self-awareness. Many people stay trapped because they lie to themselves about their lives and habits. Avoiding truth often creates more suffering than facing it directly. Honesty creates emotional freedom and opens the door to change. Vulnerability strengthens genuine human connection. True honesty is different from self-hatred or harsh self-criticism. Awareness of reality is necessary before meaningful growth can happen. Actionable lessons. Spend time regularly reflecting honestly on your emotions and habits. Stop automatically pretending everything is okay when it is not. Identify areas of life where you feel emotionally drained or disconnected. Ask yourself difficult questions instead of constantly distracting yourself. Practice accountability without destroying your self-worth. Build relationships where emotional honesty feels safe and encouraged. Reflective questions. What truths about your life have you been avoiding? Where are you pretending to be happier or stronger than you actually feel? What habits or routines are you justifying even though they hurt you? Are you living according to your own values or trying to satisfy external expectations? What would change if you became completely honest with yourself today? How much energy are you spending maintaining appearances instead of living authentically? In the chapter Accepting Imperfection, Mark Mehigan confronts one of the biggest emotional traps of modern life: the belief that people must become perfect before they deserve happiness, confidence, love, or peace. Throughout the book, Mark repeatedly challenges unrealistic self-help culture, but this chapter cuts even deeper by exposing how perfectionism quietly controls the way many people think about themselves every single day. He explains that countless individuals spend their lives believing they are always one improvement away from finally feeling good enough. One more achievement, one more promotion, one better body, one more productive routine, one more accomplishment, and then, supposedly, happiness will arrive. But Mark argues that this mindset keeps people trapped in a constant state of emotional dissatisfaction because perfection is a moving target that can never truly be reached. One of the most relatable ideas in this chapter is how perfectionism disguises itself as ambition. Society often praises people who constantly push themselves harder, but Mark explains that beneath perfectionism there is usually fear of failure, rejection, judgment, or not being worthy enough. Imagine someone who never allows themselves to rest because they feel guilty whenever they are not productive. Or a student who gets excellent grades yet feels devastated by a single mistake because their entire self-worth depends on flawless performance. Another person may avoid pursuing creative dreams entirely because they fear not being immediately successful. In all these cases, perfectionism creates paralysis instead of fulfillment. Rather than helping people grow, it convinces them that anything less than perfection is failure. Mark also explores how social media intensifies this problem by creating unrealistic standards for how life should look. Every day, people scroll through carefully edited images of success, beauty, relationships, wealth, fitness, and happiness, and slowly begin believing that everyone else's life figured out except them. Someone sees a perfectly organized morning routine online and suddenly feels lazy for struggling to manage basic daily stress. Another person watches motivational content nonstop and starts believing they should always feel inspired, disciplined, and emotionally stable. Mark highlights how dangerous this constant comparison becomes because people stop appreciating their real lives while chasing impossible standards created by strangers online. One of the most emotionally powerful moments in this chapter is a realization that imperfection is not a flaw in human life. It is part of being human itself. Mark explains that everyone carries insecurities, emotional wounds, fears, contradictions, and weaknesses, even the people who appear confident on the surface. Imagine meeting someone you admire deeply only to discover they privately struggle with anxiety, self-doubt, or feelings of inadequacy too. This realization can feel strangely freeing because it destroys the illusion that happiness belongs only to perfect people. In reality, no one reaches a permanent state where all problems disappear and life becomes completely polished. People are constantly learning, failing, adapting, and evolving. The chapter also challenges the idea that self-improvement should come from self-hatred. Many people try to change themselves because they secretly believe they are not acceptable as they are. Mark argues that this mindset creates endless emotional exhaustion because no achievement can permanently fix a lack of self-acceptance. Think about someone who loses weight, earns more money, or gains social validation, only to discover they still feel insecure internally. The external change may temporarily boost confidence, but without self-acceptance, the mind quickly finds new flaws to obsess over. Mark emphasizes that healthy growth comes from self-respect, not self-rejection. Wanting to improve your life is healthy, but believing you are worthless until you improve is emotionally destructive. Another important lesson in this chapter is that perfectionism often prevents people from fully living. Many individuals delay joy, creativity, relationships, and opportunities because they feel unprepared or not ready yet. Someone avoids starting a YouTube channel because they fear imperfect videos. Another person never opens up emotionally because they worry about saying the wrong thing. A writer spends years endlessly planning a book, but never actually begins because they fear criticism. Mark explains that perfectionism creates the illusion of safety while quietly stealing real experiences from people's lives. Ironically, growth usually comes through messy action, mistakes, awkward moments, and learning through failure, not through waiting to become perfect beforehand. What makes this chapter especially meaningful is its balance between realism and hope. Mark is not telling people to give up on personal growth or stop caring about improvement. Instead, he encourages readers to stop treating themselves like unfinished projects that only deserve love once they are perfected. Accepting imperfection means understanding that flaws, mistakes, uncertainty, and emotional struggles are normal parts of life, not evidence that someone is failing. This mindset creates freedom because people stop fighting themselves constantly. There are practical lessons viewers can apply immediately from this chapter. One powerful step is noticing how often self-worth becomes tied to performance. Ask yourself whether you only feel valuable when succeeding or being productive. Another lesson is learning to take imperfect action instead of endlessly waiting for confidence or perfection. Mark also encourages practicing self-compassion during mistakes instead of turning every failure into proof of inadequacy. Even simple habits like limiting comparison on social media, celebrating progress instead of perfection, and allowing yourself to be human can gradually weaken perfectionism's control. The deeper message of this chapter is that perfection is not the goal of life. Genuine peace comes from accepting that being human means being imperfect, emotional, uncertain, flawed, and constantly growing. People do not need to become flawless to deserve happiness, connection, or meaning. Often, the moment someone stops chasing perfection is the moment they finally begin living more honestly and freely. Main points. Perfectionism keeps people trapped in constant dissatisfaction. Many individuals believe they must become better before they deserve happiness. Social media creates unrealistic expectations about success and happiness. Perfectionism is often driven by fear of failure or rejection. Self-improvement based on self-hatred leads to emotional exhaustion. Growth happens through imperfect action, mistakes, and learning. Accepting imperfection creates emotional freedom and self-compassion. Actionable lessons. Stop tying your self-worth entirely to achievement or productivity. Practice taking action even when things are not perfect. Reduce unhealthy comparison with people online. Treat mistakes as opportunities for growth instead of proof of failure. Focus on progress and consistency instead of unrealistic perfection. Practice self-compassion during difficult moments. Reflective questions. What unrealistic expectations are you placing on yourself? Do you believe you must become perfect before you deserve happiness? How often does fear of failure stop you from taking action? Are your goals motivated by growth or by fear of not being good enough? What experiences have you delayed because you felt unprepared or imperfect? How would your life change if you allowed yourself to be imperfect and still worthy? In the chapter Society's Pressure to Have It All Together, Mark Mehigan explores one of the most exhausting modern expectations, the idea that adults are supposed to constantly appear confident, successful, emotionally stable, financially secure, socially active, physically attractive, and completely certain about their future. Mark explains that society quietly teaches people that struggling should be hidden, and that confusion is something to feel ashamed of. As a result, countless individuals spend enormous energy trying to create the appearance of having life under control even when they are internally overwhelmed, anxious, or emotionally lost. This chapter becomes incredibly relatable because almost everyone, at some point, feels pressure to pretend they know exactly what they are doing while secretly feeling uncertain inside. One of the most powerful ideas in this chapter is how early these pressures begin. From a young age, people ask questions like, what do you want to become? When are you getting married? Why haven't you achieved more yet? Or what are you doing with your life? Over time, these questions create the impression that life follows a strict timeline and that falling behind somehow means failing. Imagine someone in their late 20s watching friends get married, buy homes, launch businesses, or achieve career success while they themselves still feel confused about their direction. Even if their life is perfectly normal, they may start feeling like something is wrong with them simply because their journey looks different from other people's. Mark explains that this comparison creates enormous anxiety because people stop living according to their own needs and begin chasing milestones designed by society instead. The chapter also explores how social media intensifies the pressure to appear put together. Every day, people are exposed to carefully curated images of productivity, success, luxury lifestyles, perfect relationships, fitness transformations, and constant happiness. Rarely do they see the loneliness, stress, financial problems, insecurity, or emotional struggles hidden behind those polished images. Mark points out that many people begin believing everyone else is handling life effortlessly while they alone are struggling. Imagine someone scrolling through social media late at night after a difficult day. They see smiling couples, successful entrepreneurs, expensive vacations, and motivational posts about living your best life. Instead of feeling inspired, they feel increasingly inadequate because their own life feels messy, uncertain, and emotionally complicated by comparison. Over time, this constant exposure can make ordinary human struggles feel like personal failures. One particularly relatable lesson in this chapter is how people begin performing adulthood rather than actually experiencing life honestly. Many individuals become more focused on looking successful than feeling fulfilled. Someone may stay in a job they hate because it sounds impressive socially. Another person may remain in a relationship that no longer makes them happy because they fear appearing unsuccessful or alone. Some people even hide emotional struggles from close friends and family because they feel pressure to always appear strong and capable. Mark explains that this performance becomes emotionally exhausting because maintaining appearances requires constant suppression of vulnerability, uncertainty, and authentic emotion. The chapter also highlights how dangerous it is when people believe they are the only ones struggling. Since everyone is hiding their problems publicly, it creates the illusion that everybody else has life figured out. But in reality, many people who appear successful externally are privately dealing with anxiety, burnout, loneliness, insecurity, addiction, or confusion about their future. Think about someone who looks extremely confident online, yet feels deeply disconnected and emotionally exhausted in private. Or a person with a successful career who secretly feels trapped and unfulfilled every day. Mark emphasizes that much of adulthood is simply learning, adapting, failing, and improvising as life changes unexpectedly. Very few people truly feel fully together all the time. Another important idea in this chapter is that society often values productivity more than emotional well-being. People are encouraged to constantly improve, achieve, and stay busy, but rarely taught how to rest, process emotions, or define happiness for themselves. Imagine someone who feels guilty every time they relax because they believe they should always be working toward the next achievement. Or a person who reaches major life goals but still feels emotionally empty because they spent years chasing external validation instead of asking what genuinely fulfills them. Mark explains that the pressure to constantly succeed can disconnect people from their own emotional needs and personal values. What makes this chapter especially meaningful is that Mark encourages readers to stop measuring their worth against unrealistic timelines and social expectations. He reminds people that life is not a competition where everyone must achieve identical milestones at the same age. Some people discover purpose later. Some relationships fail before healthier ones appear. Some careers change completely over time. Some people need years to heal emotionally before building the life they truly want. None of this means someone is failing. It simply means life is unpredictable and deeply individual. There are practical lessons viewers can apply immediately from this chapter. One important step is reducing comparison, especially online. Constantly measuring your life against curated images damages mental health and creates unrealistic expectations. Another lesson is learning to define success personally rather than socially. Ask yourself whether your goals genuinely align with your values or are simply designed to gain approval from others. Mark also encourages people to normalize vulnerability by having more honest conversations about uncertainty, stress, and emotional struggles instead of pretending to always have everything under control. The deeper message of this chapter is that nobody truly has life completely figured out. Behind many polished appearances are ordinary human beings dealing with fear, confusion, insecurity, and emotional struggles just like everyone else. The pressure to have it all together often creates more suffering than growth because it teaches people to perform instead of live honestly. Real peace begins when people stop trying to meet impossible expectations and start building lives that feel meaningful to them personally, even if those lives do not look perfect from the outside. Main points. Society pressures people to appear successful, stable, and confident at all times. Social media creates unrealistic comparisons and expectations. Many people feel behind in life because they compare themselves to others' timelines. People often prioritize looking successful over feeling fulfilled. Most adults secretly struggle with uncertainty despite appearing put together. Constant productivity pressure can disconnect people from emotional well-being. Real fulfillment comes from living according to personal values, not social expectations. Actionable lessons. Reduce unhealthy comparison with people online and in daily life. Define success based on what genuinely fulfills you personally. Stop measuring your life against rigid societal timelines. Allow yourself to admit uncertainty and emotional struggles honestly. Prioritize emotional well-being instead of constant productivity. Build a life that feels meaningful to you rather than impressive to others. Reflective questions. How much of your stress comes from comparing your life to other people's? Are your current goals truly yours? Or are they based on social pressure? What parts of your life are you performing instead of honestly experiencing? Do you feel fulfilled internally, or only validated externally? What expectations are making you feel like you are behind in life? How would your life change if you stopped trying to appear perfect and focus on being authentic instead? In the chapter Learning to be Good Enough, Mark Mehigan explores one of the deepest emotional struggles many people carry silently throughout their lives, the feeling that they are never truly enough. No matter how much they achieve, improve, earn, or accomplish, there's always a voice in the background whispering that they should be doing more, becoming more, or proving more. Mark explains that this mindset creates a painful cycle where people constantly chase validation while never allowing themselves to feel satisfied with who they already are. This chapter becomes incredibly emotional because it reveals how exhausting life becomes when self-worth always feels conditional. One of the strongest ideas in this chapter is that many people unknowingly build their entire identity around achievement and approval. From childhood, people are often praised for performance rather than simply for existing. Good grades earn attention. Success earns respect. Productivity earns validation. Over time, many individuals begin believing their value depends entirely on what they accomplish. Imagine someone who only feels proud of themselves when they are being productive. The moment they rest, make mistakes, or fall behind, they immediately feel guilty or worthless. Or think about a person who constantly seeks reassurance from others because deep inside they fear they are not lovable without proving themselves first. Mark explains that this emotional dependence on external validation traps people in a constant state of insecurity because no amount of success permanently silences self-doubt. The chapter also highlights how modern culture profits from making people feel inadequate. Every advertisement, motivational message, and social media post seems to suggest that people are incomplete and need fixing. Better body, better career, better relationship, better mindset, better lifestyle. While self-improvement itself is not bad, Mark points out that many people become addicted to endless improvement because they secretly believe they are unacceptable as they are now. Imagine someone who cannot enjoy any achievement because the moment they reach one goal, they immediately obsess over the next thing missing in their life. Instead of feeling grateful or fulfilled, they remain trapped in constant emotional dissatisfaction. Mark argues that this mindset quietly steals peace because people never allow themselves to simply exist without judgment. One particularly relatable lesson in this chapter is how difficult it feels to accept yourself in a world built on comparison. Social media constantly exposes people to carefully edited versions of other lives, making ordinary human struggles feel like failures. Someone sees another person becoming wealthy, fit, productive, or successful online, and suddenly begins questioning their own worth. A person who was previously content with their progress may instantly feel behind after comparing themselves to someone else's highlight reel. Mark explains that comparison creates an impossible standard because there will always be someone richer, more attractive, more talented, or more accomplished. If self-worth depends on being better than others, peace becomes impossible. The chapter also explores how the fear of not being enough affects relationships. Many people become desperate for approval because they secretly believe they must earn love by performing perfectly. Imagine someone constantly trying to please everyone, avoid conflict, or hide flaws because they fear rejection. Or a person who struggles to set boundaries because they worry others will stop liking them. Mark explains that when people do not believe they are inherently enough, they often sacrifice authenticity just to feel accepted. Over time, this creates emotional exhaustion because they are constantly performing versions of themselves designed to gain approval rather than living honestly. One of the most emotionally powerful moments in this chapter is the realization that being good enough does not mean giving up on growth or ambition. Mark is not encouraging laziness or complacency. Instead, he challenges a belief that human worth must constantly be earned through achievement. A person can want to improve their life while still accepting themselves as valuable right now. This distinction is incredibly important because many people think self-acceptance will make them lose motivation, when in reality self-hatred often creates burnout, anxiety, and emotional paralysis. Imagine two people trying to improve their health. One exercises because they despise themselves and feel ashamed of their body. The other exercises because they respect themselves and want to feel healthier. The actions may look similar externally, but emotionally they come from completely different places. Mark also explains that accepting yourself as good enough creates emotional freedom. When people stop constantly trying to prove their worth, they begin enjoying life more honestly. They become less afraid of failure because mistakes no longer define their entire identity. They stop chasing perfection endlessly. They become more authentic in relationships because they no longer feel a need to perform constantly. Imagine someone finally allowing themselves to create art, start a business, speak openly, or pursue a passion without obsessing over whether they will impress everyone. That freedom comes from understanding that personal worth is not dependent on flawless outcomes. There are practical lessons viewers can apply immediately from this chapter. One important step is noticing how often self-worth becomes tied to productivity, appearance, success, or external approval. Another lesson is learning to speak to yourself with the same compassion you would offer a close friend. Mark also encourages practicing gratitude for current progress instead of constantly focusing only on what is still missing. Even simple habits like reducing comparison online, celebrating small improvements, and allowing yourself to rest without guilt can slowly change the way you relate to yourself emotionally. The deeper message of this chapter is that people do not become worthy only after fixing every flaw or achieving every goal. Human beings are already worthy despite their imperfections, uncertainty, mistakes, and unfinished growth. Life becomes lighter when people stop treating themselves like projects that must constantly earn permission to feel valuable. Sometimes, the greatest form of healing is simply realizing that you were never required to become perfect in order to deserve peace, love, or self-respect. Main points. Many people feel their worth depends on achievement and external validation. Constant self-improvement without self-acceptance creates emotional exhaustion. Social comparison fuels feelings of inadequacy and insecurity. Fear of not being enough affects relationships and authenticity. That self-worth should not depend entirely on productivity or perfection. Healthy growth comes from self-respect rather than self-hatred. Accepting yourself as good enough creates emotional freedom and peace. Actionable lessons. Stop measuring your worth solely through achievement or productivity. Reduce comparison with others, especially on social media. Practice speaking to yourself with kindness instead of constant criticism. Allow yourself to rest without feeling guilty. Celebrate progress instead of obsessing over perfection. Pursue growth because you value yourself, not because you hate yourself. Reflective questions. What makes you feel not enough in your daily life? How much of your self-worth depends on external approval? Are you constantly chasing achievement while ignoring emotional fulfillment? What would change if you believed you were already worthy right now? Do you treat yourself with the same compassion you offer others? Are your goals driven by genuine growth or by fear of inadequacy? In the chapter Building Real Happiness, Mark Mehigan challenges one of the biggest illusions people chase throughout life, the belief that happiness is something waiting in the future. Many people spend years telling themselves, I'll finally be happy when I earn more money, become successful, find the perfect relationship, fix my appearance, or completely figure my life out. But Mark explains that this mindset creates a dangerous habit where happiness is constantly postponed. Instead of living, people remain trapped in endless emotional waiting rooms, always believing fulfillment exists somewhere just beyond their current circumstances. This chapter becomes deeply meaningful because it forces readers to question whether they are truly living their lives or simply preparing to someday feel satisfied. One of the strongest ideas in this chapter is that real happiness is very different from temporary pleasure or distraction. Mark reflects on how many people confuse stimulation with fulfillment. Alcohol, endless scrolling, shopping, constant entertainment, validation online, and external success can create brief emotional highs. But those feelings usually disappear quickly, leaving people searching for the next escape. Imagine someone spending hours buying things they do not need just to feel excitement for a few moments, only to return to the same emptiness afterward. Or a person chasing social media attention because likes and praise temporarily make them feel important, yet deep down they still feel insecure and disconnected. Mark argues that real happiness is quieter and more stable than these temporary emotional spikes. It is built slowly through honesty, meaningful relationships, self-respect, purpose, and emotional presence. The chapter also explores how many people sabotage happiness by constantly comparing their lives to unrealistic standards. Modern culture promotes the idea that happiness should look exciting, glamorous, and perfect all the time. Social media especially creates the illusion that other people are living permanently fulfilled lives filled with success, travel, romance, confidence, and non-stop excitement. As a result, ordinary moments begin feeling inadequate. Imagine someone sitting peacefully with family or enjoying a quiet evening, but instead of appreciating it, they feel restless because their life does not resemble the dramatic excitement they constantly see online. Mark explains that comparison steals appreciation for the simple experiences that often create genuine happiness in the first place. One particularly emotional lesson in this chapter is the realization that happiness is often built through acceptance rather than constant chasing. Many people believe happiness will arrive only once all problems disappear, but Mark points out that life will always contain uncertainty, stress, mistakes, and emotional struggles. Waiting for perfect conditions before allowing yourself peace means happiness may never arrive at all. Think about someone who refuses to enjoy their current life because they are obsessed with fixing every flaw first. They cannot relax until they earn more, look better, become more successful, or solve every insecurity. Years pass, but satisfaction never fully comes because the mind keeps creating new conditions for happiness. Mark explains that genuine peace begins when people stop treating happiness like a reward for perfection and start appreciating life as it already exists. The chapter also highlights the importance of meaningful connection. Mark explains that many people chase status, achievement, and external success while neglecting relationships, emotional honesty, and community. Yet some of the happiest moments in life are surprisingly simple: laughing with close friends, feeling emotionally understood, helping someone, enjoying peaceful routines, or sharing honest conversations without pretending to be someone else. Imagine a person who spends years obsessively chasing career success only to realize they feel deeply lonely despite achieving everything they thought would make them happy. Or someone who discovers that the moments bringing them the most peace are not expensive or impressive at all, but ordinary moments of connection and emotional presence. Mark reminds readers that happiness is often less about possessing more and more about being genuinely connected to life itself. Another important lesson in this chapter is that happiness requires emotional honesty. Many people search for happiness externally while ignoring unresolved emotional pain internally. Mark explains that avoiding difficult emotions, constantly distracting yourself, or pretending to be fine creates emotional numbness over time. Real happiness is not about never feeling sadness, anxiety, or struggle. Instead, it comes from developing a healthier relationship with yourself and your emotions. Imagine someone who finally stops running from discomfort through distractions and begins confronting their fears, insecurities, and emotional needs honestly. That process may feel difficult initially, but it creates a deeper sense of peace because they are no longer divided internally between appearance and reality. What makes this chapter especially hopeful is that Mark presents happiness as something accessible in ordinary life rather than a distant fantasy reserved for perfect people. Happiness is not necessarily found in dramatic transformations or external achievements alone. It can grow through small, consistent choices, taking care of mental health, building authentic relationships, reducing comparison, creating meaningful routines, setting boundaries, practicing gratitude, and becoming more emotionally present each day. These small shifts may not look exciting externally, but over time they create a stable sense of fulfillment far deeper than temporary pleasure ever could. There are practical lessons viewers can apply immediately from this chapter. One powerful step is paying attention to what genuinely brings peace versus what only provides temporary distraction. Another lesson is learning to appreciate ordinary moments instead of constantly chasing future milestones. Mark also encourages viewers to spend less time performing happiness online and more time creating real experiences offline. Practicing gratitude, protecting mental health, reducing overstimulation, nurturing relationships, and becoming more emotionally honest are all presented as foundations for long-term fulfillment. The deeper message of this chapter is that happiness is not something people finally unlock after becoming perfect or achieving every goal. Real happiness is built gradually through self-awareness, connection, acceptance, and living honestly in the present moment. People spend so much time chasing extraordinary lives that they often overlook the quiet, ordinary moments where genuine peace actually exists. And sometimes, the happiest life is not the most impressive one. It is simply the one where a person finally feels free to be fully themselves. Main points. Many people wrongly believe happiness exists only in the future. Temporary pleasure and distraction are different from genuine fulfillment. Constant comparison destroys appreciation for ordinary life. Happiness does not require perfect circumstances. Meaningful relationships and emotional connection create deeper fulfillment. Emotional honesty is necessary for lasting peace. Real happiness is often built through small, consistent choices and simple moments. Actionable lessons. Focus on experiences and relationships that bring genuine peace rather than temporary stimulation. Reduce unhealthy comparison on social media. Practice gratitude for ordinary moments in daily life. Stop postponing happiness until everything becomes perfect. Spend more time creating authentic connections and less time performing for validation. Build routines that support emotional well-being and mental clarity. Reflective questions. What are you currently chasing that you believe will finally make you happy? Are your daily habits creating fulfillment or only temporary distraction? How often do you appreciate ordinary moments instead of rushing past them? What simple experiences genuinely make you feel peaceful and alive? Are you waiting for perfect circumstances before allowing yourself happiness? What would your life look like if you focused more on presence and less on comparison? In the chapter Relationships and Vulnerability, Mark Mehigan explores why so many people desperately crave deep human connection while simultaneously fearing the emotional openness required to create it. Throughout the book, Mark repeatedly discusses loneliness, insecurity, ego, and emotional avoidance. But this chapter brings those ideas into relationships and reveals how difficult it can be for people to truly let themselves be seen. He explains that many relationships fail not because people do not care about each other, but because they spend too much time protecting themselves emotionally instead of communicating honestly. This chapter becomes deeply relatable because almost everyone has experienced a fear of rejection, misunderstanding, abandonment, or emotional exposure at some point in life. One of the strongest ideas in this chapter is that vulnerability feels dangerous because it removes control. When people open up emotionally, they risk judgment, disappointment, rejection, or heartbreak. As a result, many individuals build emotional walls without even realizing it. Imagine someone who jokes constantly whenever conversations become serious because humor feels safer than honesty. Or a person who never fully expresses affection because they fear appearing too emotional or becoming vulnerable to rejection. Another individual may avoid relationships entirely after being hurt in the past because staying emotionally distant feels safer than risking pain again. Mark explains that these protective behaviors may reduce short-term discomfort, but they also block genuine intimacy and connection. The chapter also explores how modern culture encourages emotional performance instead of emotional honesty. People are taught to appear confident, independent, and emotionally composed at all times. Many individuals feel pressure to seem unbothered even when they are deeply affected internally. Social media worsens this by encouraging people to showcase idealized versions of relationships while hiding conflict, insecurity, loneliness, and emotional struggles. Imagine a couple posting happy photos online while privately struggling with communication and emotional distance. Or someone constantly surrounded by people yet secretly feeling unseen because nobody knows what they genuinely feel inside. Mark points out that many relationships remain emotionally shallow because both people are performing carefully controlled versions of themselves instead of communicating authentically. One particularly emotional lesson in this chapter is how fear of vulnerability often creates the exact loneliness people are trying to avoid. Many individuals desperately want love, understanding, and closeness, but they avoid honesty because they fear getting hurt. As a result, they remain emotionally guarded, and their relationships never move beyond surface-level interaction. Think about someone who says, "I'm fine" every time they are struggling, even around close friends or partners. Over time, people around them may assume everything is okay because they are never allowed to see the deeper reality. The person then feels misunderstood and disconnected, even though they are the one hiding emotionally. Mark explains that connection requires risk because people cannot feel emotionally close to someone who is constantly hiding behind masks. The chapter also highlights how vulnerability strengthens relationships rather than weakening them. Many people believe being emotionally open will make others see them as weak or broken, but Mark argues the opposite is often true. Honest conversations create trust because they allow people to feel genuinely known instead of merely observed. Imagine a person finally admitting to their partner that they feel insecure, overwhelmed, or emotionally exhausted after pretending to be okay for months. That conversation may feel uncomfortable initially, but it can create a level of emotional intimacy impossible through surface-level communication alone. Mark emphasizes that relationships become stronger when people stop trying to appear perfect and start allowing themselves to be human around each other. Another important lesson in this chapter is that vulnerability also involves accepting uncertainty. Real relationships cannot be completely controlled. People may disappoint each other, misunderstand each other, or even leave. But Mark explains that trying to avoid all emotional risk often creates a life filled with distance and loneliness instead. Imagine someone who never says, "I love you" first because they fear not hearing it back. Or a person who avoids difficult conversations because they worry conflict will damage the relationship. These protective behaviors may temporarily feel safe, but over time they prevent genuine closeness from developing. Mark suggests that emotional courage is necessary because meaningful relationships require honesty, trust, and openness despite uncertainty. The chapter becomes especially relatable when discussing how unresolved personal struggles affect relationships. Many people expect relationships to magically heal insecurity, loneliness, or emotional pain, but Mark explains that unresolved issues often follow people into their connections with others. Someone who secretly believes they are unworthy of love may constantly seek reassurance or fear abandonment. Another person who struggles with vulnerability may emotionally withdraw during conflict instead of communicating openly. Mark encourages readers to understand their own emotional patterns because self-awareness improves the way people connect with others. One of the most hopeful ideas in this chapter is that vulnerability creates the possibility for genuine belonging. Many people spend their lives trying to appear impressive, strong, funny, successful, or emotionally invulnerable in order to gain acceptance. But Mark explains that true connection happens when people are accepted despite their imperfections, fears, and emotional struggles, not because those things are hidden. Imagine finally having a friendship or relationship where you do not feel pressure to constantly perform or pretend. That sense of emotional safety is what many people are truly searching for underneath all their defenses. There are practical lessons viewers can apply immediately from this chapter. One important step is practicing small moments of emotional honesty instead of constantly hiding behind automatic responses like "I'm fine." Another lesson is learning to communicate openly about fears, needs, and emotions instead of expecting others to read minds. Mark also encourages people to notice when defensiveness, humor, avoidance, or emotional withdrawal are being used to avoid vulnerability. Building healthy relationships requires emotional courage, active listening, empathy, and the willingness to be imperfect around others. The deeper message of this chapter is that vulnerability is not weakness, it is a foundation of meaningful human connection. People spend so much energy protecting themselves from emotional pain that they sometimes accidentally protect themselves from love, understanding, and belonging too. Real relationships are built not through perfection, but through honesty, openness, and the courage to let another person truly see you. In the chapter Freedom Through Simplicity, Mark Mehigan explores a powerful idea that feels almost rebellious in modern life. Maybe people are not overwhelmed because they lack more things, but because they already have too much noise, pressure, distraction, and emotional clutter in their lives. Throughout the book, Mark talks about chasing validation, escaping discomfort, performing success, and constantly trying to become better. But in this chapter, he shifts focus towards something surprisingly simple: the realization that peace often comes not from adding more to life, but from removing what no longer matters. This chapter feels deeply refreshing because it challenges the exhausting belief that happiness always requires bigger achievements, more possessions, more productivity, or non-stop stimulation. One of the strongest ideas in this chapter is that modern life constantly pushes people toward excess. More information, more entertainment, more goals, more comparison, more consumption. People are surrounded by endless pressure telling them to optimize every moment, improve every weakness, and stay constantly busy. As a result, many individuals become mentally exhausted without fully understanding why. Imagine someone waking up and immediately checking notifications, emails, social media, news updates, and endless content before their brain has even had a moment of silence. Their day becomes filled with pressure, distractions, and mental overload, yet they still feel guilty whenever they slow down. Mark explains that many people have become so used to chaos that they no longer remember what genuine calm feels like. The chapter also explores how simplicity creates clarity. When life becomes overcrowded with distractions, unnecessary obligations, toxic environments, and constant stimulation, people lose connection with themselves. Think about someone who says yes to every social invitation, works non-stop, consumes endless online content, and fills every quiet moment with entertainment. Eventually, they may start feeling emotionally numb or disconnected without understanding the reason. Mark suggests that constant noise prevents self-awareness because people rarely give themselves enough silence to think honestly about what they actually feel or want. Simplicity, on the other hand, creates space, mentally, emotionally, and physically. It allows people to notice what truly matters instead of constantly reacting to everything around them. One particularly relatable lesson in this chapter is how people often mistake busyness for meaning. Society praises people who are constantly productive and overwhelmed, as if exhaustion itself proves importance. Imagine someone who cannot relax without feeling guilty because they believe resting means falling behind in life. Or a person who fills every minute with work, scrolling, entertainment, or social obligations because silence feels uncomfortable. Mark explains that many people are terrified of slowing down because quiet moments force them to confront emotions, insecurities, or dissatisfaction they normally avoid through distraction. But ironically, that constant busyness often pulls them further away from fulfillment instead of closer to it. The chapter also highlights how simplicity applies not only to physical possessions but to emotional life as well. Mark discusses the emotional weight people carry unnecessarily, trying to impress everyone, maintaining fake images, chasing approval, holding grudges, staying in draining relationships, obsessing over comparison, or constantly worrying about other people's opinions. Imagine someone spending years trying to appear successful online while privately feeling anxious and exhausted. Or a person staying connected to toxic relationships simply because they fear loneliness. Mark argues that true freedom often comes from letting go of unnecessary emotional burdens rather than endlessly adding new achievements or distractions. Another important idea in this chapter is that simple living does not mean giving up ambition or becoming lazy. Mark is not promoting isolation or rejecting goals entirely. Instead, he encourages intentional living. The question becomes, what actually adds value to my life and what simply creates noise? For example, someone may realize they are pursuing certain goals not because they genuinely care about them, but because society taught them those achievements would make them look impressive. Another person may discover that their happiest moments come not from expensive experiences or external success, but from peaceful routines, close relationships, meaningful conversations, creative hobbies, or simply feeling mentally calm for the first time in years. One of the most emotionally powerful moments in this chapter is the realization that peace is often hidden inside ordinary moments people overlook while chasing bigger things. Imagine someone sitting quietly with loved ones, enjoying a peaceful morning, taking a walk without distractions, or laughing sincerely with close friends. These moments may seem small compared to the dramatic images of success promoted online, yet they often create the deepest sense of fulfillment. Mark explains that people spend so much time chasing extraordinary lives that they accidentally ignore the simple experiences that make life genuinely meaningful. The chapter becomes especially practical when discussing how simplifying life can improve mental health. Reducing overstimulation, setting boundaries, limiting comparison, decluttering environments, spending less time online, and focusing on fewer meaningful priorities can dramatically reduce emotional exhaustion. Imagine someone who constantly feels anxious because their attention is scattered across endless notifications, obligations, and expectations. Once they simplify their routines and remove unnecessary distractions, they begin feeling mentally lighter and emotionally calmer. Mark emphasizes that simplicity creates space for reflection, gratitude, emotional presence, and deeper connection. There are practical lessons viewers can apply immediately from this chapter. One important step is identifying what genuinely adds value to life versus what only creates stress or distraction. Another lesson is learning to become comfortable with silence and stillness instead of constantly seeking stimulation. Mark also encourages viewers to simplify not only their physical surroundings but also their emotional priorities. Protecting peace sometimes requires saying no, reducing comparison, disconnecting from unhealthy influences, and focusing more intentionally on what truly matters. The deeper message of this chapter is that freedom does not always come from gaining more. Sometimes it comes from needing less. Modern life convinces people that happiness exists in endless accumulation, more success, more validation, more productivity, more possessions. But Mark suggests the opposite may often be true. Real peace begins when people stop overcrowding their life with noise and start creating space for presence, honesty, connection, and simplicity. And sometimes, the simplest life can feel richer than the most impressive one. Main points. Modern life overwhelms people with constant noise, pressure, and distraction. Simplicity creates mental clarity and emotional peace. Many people confuse business with meaning or success. Constant stimulation prevents self-awareness and emotional reflection. Emotional clutter can be as exhausting as physical clutter. Peace is often found in ordinary moments rather than dramatic achievements. Real freedom sometimes comes from needing less, not gaining more. Actionable lessons. Reduce unnecessary distractions and overstimulation in daily life. Spend more time in silence and reflection instead of constant consumption. Identify relationships, habits, or obligations that emotionally drain you. Focus on fewer priorities that genuinely matter to you. Practice gratitude for simple everyday experiences. Create routines that support calmness, clarity, and emotional balance. Reflective questions. What parts of your life currently create unnecessary stress or noise? Are you constantly busy, or are you genuinely fulfilled? What distractions are preventing you from connecting with yourself honestly? Which simple moments in your life bring you the most peace? Are your goals aligned with your values or with social expectations? What would you need to let go of in order to feel mentally lighter and freer? In the chapter Finding Meaning Beyond Success, Mark Mehigan confronts one of the most uncomfortable truths in modern life. Achieving success does not automatically create fulfillment. Society constantly teaches people to chase money, status, productivity, recognition, and achievement as if these things are the ultimate purpose of existence. From childhood, people are encouraged to succeed academically, build careers, earn more, look impressive, and constantly move upward. But Mark explains that many individuals eventually reach the goals they once dreamed about only to discover an unexpected emptiness waiting on the other side. This chapter becomes emotionally powerful because it exposes the silent disappointment many people feel when external success fails to solve internal struggles. One of the strongest ideas in this chapter is that success and meaning are not the same thing. A person can appear successful externally while feeling deeply disconnected internally. Imagine someone working tirelessly for years to build a prestigious career. They finally earn the promotion, higher salary, and recognition they always wanted. Friends admire them. Family feels proud. Online, their life looks impressive. Yet privately, they feel exhausted, emotionally numb, and strangely unfulfilled. Instead of happiness, They experience confusion because the achievement that was supposed to change everything only created temporary excitement. Mark explains that this experience is far more common than people realize because society teaches individuals how to chase success but rarely teaches them how to build a meaningful life. The chapter also explores how many people unknowingly sacrifice themselves while pursuing achievement. Relationships become secondary. Mental health gets ignored. Rest feels guilty. Personal values slowly disappear beneath endless productivity and pressure. Think about someone who spends years obsessively chasing financial success while gradually losing touch with friendships, hobbies, emotional well-being, and even their sense of identity. One day they pause and realize they no longer know who they are outside of work, achievement, or external validation. Mark highlights how dangerous it becomes when people build their entire identity around accomplishment because failure, slowing down, or uncertainty suddenly feels like losing their entire sense of worth. One particularly relatable lesson in this chapter is how society constantly moves the goalpost of success. People believe happiness will arrive once they reach a certain milestone, but the moment they achieve it, new expectations immediately appear. Someone thinks, "I'll be satisfied once I earn this amount of money," but after reaching it, they start comparing themselves to wealthier people. Another person finally gains online popularity or recognition, but becomes obsessed with maintaining it. Mark explains that external success often creates endless hunger because validation from the outside world is unstable and temporary. There is always someone more successful, more talented, richer, or more admired. If meaning depends entirely on outperforming others, peace becomes impossible. The chapter also challenges a cultural obsession with productivity. Modern life often treats human beings like machines whose value depends on how much they achieve. Imagine someone feeling anxious every time they rest because they believe they should always be working towards something bigger. Or a person who cannot enjoy free time without guilt because they tie their self-worth entirely to productivity. Mark argues that this mindset disconnects people from the deeper experiences that actually make life meaningful: relationships, creativity, emotional connection, presence, kindness, curiosity, peace, and authenticity. Success may provide comfort or opportunities, but it cannot replace purpose, belonging, or emotional fulfillment. Another emotionally powerful idea in this chapter is that meaning is often found in ordinary moments rather than dramatic achievements. Society glorifies extraordinary success stories, but Mark explains that many meaningful parts of life are surprisingly simple. Imagine sharing an honest conversation with someone who truly understands you, helping a friend through a difficult time, spending peaceful moments with family, creating something meaningful even if nobody applauds it publicly, feeling emotionally present instead of constantly distracted. These experiences may not look impressive online, but they often create a deeper sense of fulfillment than external status ever could. Mark reminds readers that people sometimes spend so much time building impressive lives that they forget to build meaningful ones. The chapter also explores the fear many people experience when questioning traditional definitions of success. Admitting that money, status, or achievement are not enough can feel frightening because it forces people to rethink the goals they spent years chasing. Imagine someone realizing they climbed the wrong ladder entirely, working toward a version of success that looked admirable externally but felt empty internally. This realization can feel painful, but Mark presents it as an opportunity rather than a failure. Once people stop blindly following society's expectations, they gain the freedom to define fulfillment for themselves instead of inheriting someone else's idea of what life should look like. What makes this chapter especially hopeful is that Mark does not reject ambition entirely. He is not saying success is meaningless or wrong. Instead, he encourages balance and self-awareness. Success becomes dangerous only when it replaces identity, emotional health, relationships, or purpose. A healthy life includes ambition, but it also includes connection, rest, honesty, creativity, and emotional presence. Mark encourages readers to ask deeper questions beyond achievement alone. What kind of life actually feels meaningful to me? What experiences make me feel alive? Who am I when I stop trying to impress people? There are practical lessons viewers can apply immediately from this chapter. One important step is examining whether current goals genuinely align with personal values or are simply driven by social pressure and comparison. Another lesson is creating space for fulfillment outside achievement, through relationships, creativity, hobbies, service, emotional growth, or meaningful experiences. Mark also encourages viewers to stop postponing life until success finally arrives and instead begin appreciating meaning in the present moment. The deeper message of this chapter is that success alone cannot satisfy a person who feels disconnected from themselves. Meaning comes not only from what people achieve, but from how they live, connect, grow, and experience life emotionally. A person can have status without peace, wealth without fulfillment, and recognition without belonging. Real happiness begins when people stop chasing success as a final answer to life and start building lives that feel meaningful from the inside, not just impressive from the outside. Main points. External success does not automatically create fulfillment or happiness. Many people sacrifice emotional well-being while chasing achievement. Society constantly shifts expectations, making success feel endless. Productivity and status cannot replace meaning or emotional connection. Meaning is often found in simple everyday experiences. Personal worth should not depend entirely on achievement. Fulfillment comes from living according to authentic values, not social pressure. Actionable lessons. Reflect on whether your goals truly align with your personal values. Build fulfillment through relationships, creativity, and emotional presence. Stop tying your identity completely to productivity or achievement. Appreciate meaningful ordinary moments instead of constantly chasing bigger milestones. Create balance between ambition and emotional well-being. Define success based on what genuinely matters to you personally. Reflective questions. What are you currently chasing? And why does it matter to you? If you achieved all your goals tomorrow, would you genuinely feel fulfilled? Have you sacrificed important parts of your life in pursuit of success? What experiences make you feel meaningful beyond achievement or validation? Are you building a life that feels authentic or simply impressive to others? Who are you when external success and recognition are removed? In the chapter Humor During Difficult Times, Mark Mehigan explores how humor can become both a survival tool and an emotional shield during life's darkest moments. Throughout the book, Mark openly discusses addiction, insecurity, mental health struggles, loneliness, and emotional pain. Yet this chapter reveals how comedy and humor helped him endure experiences that otherwise felt emotionally overwhelming. What makes this section so powerful is that Mark does not present humor as a way to ignore suffering completely. Instead, he shows how laughter can create temporary relief, human connection, perspective, and emotional breathing room even in painful situations. Sometimes, being able to laugh during difficult moments is not denial. It is proof that a person still has hope left inside them. One of the strongest ideas in this chapter is that humor often helps people survive emotionally unbearable situations. Imagine someone going through heartbreak, financial stress, family conflict, or anxiety so heavy that without moments of laughter, life would feel emotionally suffocating. Humor becomes a small escape valve that releases pressure before it becomes overwhelming. Mark explains that many people use jokes, sarcasm, funny stories, or absurd observations not because their pain is fake, but because laughter makes suffering feel more manageable. Think about a group of friends joking together during stressful times. The problems may still exist, but for a few moments, everyone feels lighter. Those moments matter more than people realize because emotional survival often happens through small breaks in the darkness. The chapter also explores how humor creates connection between people. During painful experiences, individuals often feel isolated, misunderstood, or emotionally trapped inside their own thoughts. But laughter reminds people they are not alone. Imagine someone struggling silently with anxiety who suddenly hears another person joke honestly about similar fears or insecurities. That humor can instantly create relief because it removes shame and creates shared understanding. Mark explains that comedy often works because it exposes truths many people secretly experience but rarely say out loud. When people laugh together at uncomfortable realities, it becomes easy to acknowledge those realities honestly. One particularly relatable lesson in this chapter is how humor can sometimes hide emotional pain as well. Mark honestly admits that many people, especially those seen as funny, use humor to avoid vulnerability. Imagine someone who constantly turns serious conversations into jokes because they fear emotional honesty. Or a person who makes everyone laugh while secretly feeling lonely or emotionally exhausted inside. Humor can become a protective mask that prevents others from seeing deeper struggles. Mark emphasizes that while laughter is powerful, it can also become unhealthy when used only to escape emotions instead of eventually confronting them honestly. This balance makes the chapter emotionally nuanced because it shows both the healing and avoidance sides of humor. The chapter also highlights how life becomes emotionally unbearable when people take everything too seriously all the time. Modern life is filled with pressure, comparison, expectations, failures, uncertainty, and constant stress. Mark suggests that humor helps people maintain perspective during difficult periods. Imagine someone making a mistake at work and spiraling into harsh self-criticism, believing they ruined everything. Humor, in that moment, can interrupt the spiral by reminding them they are still human and imperfect like everyone else. Sometimes being able to laugh at your own flaws, awkwardness, or mistakes prevents shame from becoming overwhelming. Mark explains that humor softens life's harsh edges and makes difficult experiences feel less emotionally crushing. Another important idea in this chapter is that humor creates resilience. People who can still find small moments of laughter during hard times often recover emotionally more effectively because humor reminds them that pain is not the entirety of life. Think about hospital patients joking with nurses during treatment, families laughing together even while facing hardship, or friends finding humor during stressful situations. These moments do not erase suffering, but they create emotional strength by proving that joy and pain can exist together at the same time. Mark argues that resilience is not about becoming emotionless or invincible. Sometimes resilience simply means finding ways to keep moving emotionally even when life feels difficult. One of the most emotionally powerful moments in this chapter is the realization that laughter often comes from shared imperfection. Perfect lives are rarely funny because humor usually emerges from awkwardness, failure, confusion, mistakes, and the absurdity of being human. Mark reminds readers that everyone feels insecure, lost, embarrassed, or overwhelmed at times, even if they hide it well publicly. Humor allows people to acknowledge those imperfections without drowning in shame. Imagine laughing with friends about embarrassing moments or personal failures years later. The ability to laugh does not mean those experiences were painless. It means people survived them. The chapter becomes especially practical when discussing how humor can improve mental health and relationships. Mark encourages readers to stop treating themselves with constant harsh seriousness. Many people speak to themselves more cruelly than they would ever speak to another person. Learning to approach life with a little more lightness, patience, and humor can reduce unnecessary emotional suffering. This does not mean avoiding responsibility or ignoring serious issues, but it means recognizing that human beings are imperfect creatures trying to navigate an unpredictable life. Humor can make that journey feel less lonely and less frightening. There are practical lessons viewers can apply immediately from this chapter. One important step is learning to laugh at small mistakes instead of turning every imperfection into a personal crisis. Another lesson is using humor to create connection rather than isolation. Mark also encourages viewers to notice when humor becomes a defense mechanism preventing emotional honesty. Healthy humor can coexist with vulnerability. In fact, the strongest emotional connections often happen when people can both laugh together and speak honestly about difficult experiences. The deeper message of this chapter is that humor is not the opposite of pain. Sometimes it is a way people survive pain. Laughter cannot solve every problem, but it can make difficult moments feel lighter, create connection during isolation, and remind people that even in hard times, life still contains moments of humanity, absurdity, and hope. And sometimes, the ability to laugh while struggling is not weakness at all. It is quiet emotional courage. Main points. Humor can help people emotionally survive difficult experiences. Laughter creates temporary relief during stress, pain, and uncertainty. Humor builds connection by exposing shared human struggles. Some people use comedy as a shield to hide deeper emotional pain. Being able to laugh at imperfections reduces shame and harsh self-judgment. Humor strengthens emotional resilience during hard times. Joy and suffering can exist together at the same time. Actionable lessons. Learn to laugh at small mistakes instead of catastrophizing them. Use humor to connect with others during stressful moments. Notice when joking becomes a way to avoid emotional honesty completely. Balance humor with vulnerability and genuine communication. Stop expecting yourself to handle life perfectly all the time. Create moments of lightness and joy even during difficult periods. Reflective questions. Do you use humor to connect with people or to hide from vulnerability? How do you react when you make mistakes or feel embarrassed? When was the last time laughter genuinely helped you through a hard moment? Are you allowing yourself moments of lightness during stressful periods? What emotional truths are hidden behind the jokes you tell? How would your life change if you treated yourself with more patience and humor? In the chapter Final Reflections on Life and Recovery, Mark Mehigan brings together the emotional lessons of his journey and delivers one of the most honest messages in the entire book. Recovery is not a magical moment where life suddenly becomes perfect. It is an ongoing process of learning how to live differently, think differently, and face reality more honestly every single day. After discussing addiction, insecurity, mental health struggles, ego, perfectionism, and emotional avoidance throughout the book, Mark ends with a quieter but more powerful realization. Healing is less about becoming a completely new person and more about finally stopping the endless war against yourself. This final chapter feels deeply human because it does not promise unrealistic transformation. Instead, it offers something more meaningful, hope rooted in honesty. One of the strongest ideas in this chapter is that many people believe recovery only applies to addiction, but Mark explained that almost everyone is recovering from something. Some people are recovering from toxic relationships. Others are recovering from childhood wounds, heartbreak, anxiety, insecurity, loneliness, burnout, grief, or years of pretending to be someone they are not. Recovery becomes a broader metaphor for rebuilding a healthier relationship with life itself. Imagine someone who spent years using work to avoid emotional pain finally learning how to slow down and confront their feelings honestly. Or a person recovering from constant self-hatred gradually learning to speak to themselves with kindness instead of criticism. Mark emphasizes that healing often happens slowly and invisibly through small daily decisions rather than dramatic overnight breakthroughs. The chapter also reflects on how difficult it can be to change old patterns. Even after recognizing unhealthy behaviors, many people continue struggling because familiar pain can feel strangely comfortable. Imagine someone who spent years escaping stress through alcohol, distraction, emotional avoidance, or toxic habits. Even when they genuinely want change, the brain still pulls them toward old coping mechanisms because those behaviors once provided temporary relief. Mark explains that recovery requires patience because healing is rarely linear. People may improve, relapse emotionally, doubt themselves, or feel lost again before gradually finding stability. This honesty makes a chapter especially powerful because it removes the unrealistic expectation that growth should always look clean and perfect. One particularly emotional lesson in this chapter is the realization that self-awareness alone is not enough. Action matters too. Many people intellectually understand their problems, yet continue repeating the same destructive cycle because change feels uncomfortable. Mark highlights how recovery often involves choosing discomfort intentionally instead of constantly escaping it. For example, someone recovering emotionally may need to sit with loneliness instead of distracting themselves constantly. Another person may need to have difficult conversations instead of avoiding conflict. Someone overcoming addiction may need to rebuild routines, relationships, and self-trust slowly over time. Mark reminds readers that healing usually feels difficult precisely because people are learning healthier ways to cope after years of surviving through harmful patterns. The chapter also explores the importance of forgiveness during recovery. Many people remain trapped in guilt and shame over past mistakes, believing they are permanently damaged because of what they have done or experienced. Imagine someone replaying regrets constantly in their mind, failed relationships, wasted years, harmful decisions, moments they wish they could undo. Mark explains that while accountability matters, endless self-punishment prevents healing because people cannot move forward while constantly emotionally attacking themselves. Recovery requires accepting that humans are flawed, imperfect, emotional creatures who make mistakes. The goal is not to erase the past, but to stop allowing the past to define every part of the future. Another powerful idea in this chapter is that recovery changes the way people define success. Earlier in life, many individuals chase status, validation, achievement, or appearances because they believe those things will finally make them feel complete. But after deep emotional struggles, priorities often shift. Peace becomes more valuable than impressing strangers. Honest relationships become more important than social approval. Mental stability becomes more meaningful than constant productivity. Imagine someone who once obsessed over appearing successful online now valuing quiet mornings, emotional honesty, healthy routines, and genuine connection far more deeply. Mark suggests that real growth often involves simplifying life and focusing less on external image and more on internal peace. The chapter becomes especially hopeful when discussing resilience. Mark reflects on how people often underestimate their ability to survive painful experiences. During dark periods, it can feel impossible to imagine life improving. But recovery teaches people that emotions change, circumstances evolve, and healing can happen gradually even when progress feels invisible day to day. Imagine someone at rock bottom believing their life will never improve, only to slowly rebuild confidence, healthier habits, stronger relationships, and emotional stability over time. The process may not be dramatic, but each small step matters. Mark emphasizes that recovery is built through consistency, honesty, support, and the willingness to keep going even during setbacks. One of the deepest messages in this chapter is that life will probably never become completely free from pain, uncertainty, or struggle, and that is okay. Many people waste years trying to achieve permanent emotional perfection. But Mark explains that healing is not about eliminating all difficult emotion forever. Instead, it is about learning how to handle life more honestly and compassionately without constantly escaping yourself. A healthy life still contains stress, sadness, insecurity, and difficult moments, but recovery changes how people respond to those experiences. There are practical lessons viewers can apply immediately from this chapter. One important step is recognizing unhealthy coping patterns honestly instead of pretending they do not exist. Another lesson is understanding that small, consistent changes matter more than dramatic temporary motivation. Mark also encourages viewers to practice self-forgiveness, ask for support when needed, and stop expecting healing to happen perfectly. Recovery is not a straight line, and setbacks do not erase progress. The deeper message of this final chapter is that healing begins when people stop trying to become flawless and start learning how to live more honestly, consciously, and compassionately. Recovery is not about creating a perfect life. It is about creating a life where you no longer need to constantly escape yourself. And sometimes, the greatest victory is simply reaching a point where you can wake up, face reality honestly, and continue moving forward with a little more peace than before. Main points. Recovery is an ongoing process, not a perfect final destination. Everyone is recovering from something, not only addiction. Healing requires action, not just self-awareness. Change is difficult because old coping patterns feel familiar. Self-forgiveness is essential for emotional growth. Real recovery often changes personal definitions of success and happiness. Progress is built through small, consistent choices over time. Actionable lessons. Identify unhealthy coping mechanisms honestly. Focus on small daily improvements instead of dramatic overnight change. Practice self-forgiveness while still taking accountability. Build routines and habits that support emotional well-being. Ask for help and emotional support when needed. Accept that healing is imperfect and setbacks are part of growth. Reflective questions. What are you currently trying to escape from emotionally? Which old habits or coping mechanisms continue holding you back? Are you allowing guilt and shame to define your future? What does recovery or healing personally mean to you? How has your definition of success changed through difficult experiences? What small step could you take today toward a healthier and more honest life? As we reach the end of This Is Not a Self-Help Book, one message becomes clear. Life is messy, imperfect, unpredictable, and deeply human. And that's okay. Throughout this journey, we explored addiction, mental health struggles, ego, vulnerability, honesty, relationships, self-worth, recovery, simplicity, and the search for real happiness beyond success or appearances. Mark Mehigan reminds us that healing does not come from pretending to be perfect, but from finally accepting ourselves honestly and choosing growth one small step at a time. If this audiobook helped you reflect on your own life, mindset, or struggles in any way, then take a moment to apply even one lesson from this book today. And if you enjoyed this summary, make sure to like this video, subscribe to Visual Books, share this audiobook with someone who might need it, and comment below with a lesson that impacted you the most. Your support helps this channel continue bringing powerful book summaries and life-changing ideas to more people around the world.